Chapter 434. Suzhou. Fan Xian chuckled and said to his grandmother, "What girls are you talking about?" "You're talking about girls. I built a Baoyue brothel in Suzhou. There are a lot of girls there." The old woman shook her head helplessly. "This is another matter. You can be an official, but you have to do this kind of romantic business. Aren't you afraid of losing face?" Fan Xian did not feel it was embarrassing. He smiled merrily and said, "That is the second prince's business. I'm just looking after it on his behalf." After he finished speaking, he looked at the third prince, who was sitting next to the old madam. The third prince's little face suddenly showed a look of embarrassment. The Baoyue brothel in the beginning had something to do with this kid. The old woman sighed and said, "Don't keep changing the topic. You know who I'm asking about." Fan Xian fell silent. He knew that his grandmother was asking about Haitang. The matter between him and Haitang had spread throughout the world. His grandmother was not a pure old woman who did not pay attention to outside matters. Of course she knew the story. However, this matter was problematic. Furthermore, in front of Wanner, he really didn't know what to say. He raised his head and smiled warmly. "Grandmother, don't listen to the rumors outside. Haitang is in Jiangnan and is only helping me handle some matters." The old woman did not believe it and said suspiciously, "Why would a northern Qi person always stay by your side? She is not an ordinary woman." Fan Xian was speechless. He secretly glanced at Wanner and found that his wife's face was calm, but her little hands were gripping the corners of her sleeves. He couldn't resist laughing bitterly, and facing his grandmother, he said, "Don't misunderstand." "Is it a misunderstanding?" The old woman looked at him with a not quite there smile. After all, there were still people in the hall, so it was not good for the old woman to speak directly. She only slowly said, "There are some things that should be done openly. I don't like to be secretive. If it is open and above board, then bring her back to see. If you don't mean it that way, then be careful. After all, although she is not a Qing person, she is still a girl. How can her reputation be ruined by you so carelessly?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Did you hear that?" said the old lady, staring at him. Fan Xian sighed and nodded. He thought to himself, this matter was not a matter of yes or no. His shamelessness had indeed been seen through by his grandmother at a glance. As for Haitang, Lang Qiao had already gone to Suzhou. Given Haitang's personality, she probably would not oppose her own sect. Once she returned to northern Qi, it would be difficult to see her again. There was no need to go into detail about what would happen next. "I said Grandma," he said with a bitter face, "I haven't been back for 2 years. Why are you scolding me as soon as we meet? Can't we talk about it later?" The old lady snorted and said, "You still know that you haven't come back for 2 years?" She glared at Fan Xian, and the wrinkles on her face gradually smoothed out. Laughing, she scolded, "You're in no hurry to go home after arriving in Danzhou. Where did you run off to earlier? You're already so old, yet you still don't know anything." Fan Xian realized that his grandmother was jealous. He laughed and said, "I got off the boat halfway and went for a walk." Without waiting for his grandmother to speak, he threw her a glance first. The grandmother and granddaughter had lived together for 16 years. How could they not know each other's hidden thoughts? The old woman coughed lightly and said, "It's getting late. Prepare to start the banquet. I still have some things to say to Nji." Finishing these words, she stood shakily and prepared to bow to the third prince in accordance with her duties. The old woman was the wet nurse of the royal family and could be considered a family servant. She paid particular attention to the hierarchy. Lin Wanner was Fan Xian's wife, so as a grandmother she did not have to care. However, the third prince was living in the house, so she always maintained etiquette. However, her position was too unique. The third prince had always called himself Fan Xian's student, so how could he accept this ancestor's bow? The child struggled until his face was bright red. He dodged away with all his might and ran out the door like his boat was on fire. Fan Xian went forward and gently held Wanner's hand. Leaning close to her ear, he said something. Wanner nodded repeatedly and took Cece out the door as ordered. There was only the old woman and Fan Xian left in the hall. Fan Xian moved over a small stool and sat beside his grandmother. Just like in the past, he listened to the lecture properly. Now that there were no outsiders, the old woman's words were much more direct. "That Haitang, what are you going to do with her?" Fan Xian tilted his head and thought for a while. He furrowed his brows and said seriously, "It will be difficult to marry her. Let's stall for some time first." "Do you want to marry her?" "Huh?" Fan Xian hesitated. He always felt that his relationship with Haitang was still more of a friend. If he married her, that feeling would probably change. "It depends on her. If she wants to marry, then I want to marry her. It's still the same old saying. After all, the Fan family is a large and influential family. How can we let her drift outside alone? The old woman coughed gently. Since you like her, you will have to marry her. Fan Xian forced a smile. He thought that this matter was not something the Fan family could decide on its own. However, since his grandmother had set the goal, he could only work hard to carry it out. He used his palm to gently pat his grandmother's back and quietly sent a sliver of Tianyi Dao's gentle jinqi into her to help her adjust her body. He was pleased to find that his grandmother's body was not bad. Although she had aged a bit these 2 years, there were no signs of decline. However, even if she marries, there must be a hierarchy, the old woman suddenly said seriously. You can't mistreat Wanner. Originally, I didn't like that girl Haitang. For her to be with you without a title or status, how is that appropriate? Fan Xian was speechless. He knew that he had been busy with official business and had indeed neglected his wife. Furthermore, Wanner appeared calm on the surface, but in the depths of her heart, she was meticulous. To say something cliched, the higher Fan Xian's position was, the more he didn't want Wanner to participate in conspiratorial affairs. It was unavoidable that Wanner would lack a real sense of existence. This kind of feeling was probably not very comfortable. However, it could be seen that Wanner was greatly liked by the old woman these days in Danzhou. Don't bring this matter up. The old woman gazed at the grandson at her knees and sighed. Gently stroking his cheek, she said, These years in Jingdou probably haven't been easy either. You know about those things, right? In reality, during the 16 years in Danzhou, Fan Xian and his grandmother had not been overly intimate with each other. Fan Xian knew that it was because his grandmother wanted to raise him into a cold and hard person. Only then would he be able to protect his life in Jingdou. When was the last time his grandmother had been so gentle? It seemed to be when he was still an infant and his grandmother had held him in the little building and cried silently. Fan Xian was slightly absent-minded. It was also because of that night that he knew that other than Uncle Wu Zhu, there was also his grandmother who treated him wholeheartedly. I know all about it. Fan Xian lowered his head. A moment later he smiled and sighed. The problem of one's birth is always so hard to imagine. The old woman smiled slightly and said, It's all in the past. I think the emperor still loves you. Fan Xian was silent and didn't reply. His grandmother had raised the Qing emperor. Presumably, deep in her heart, she was proud of this fact. However, it was clear that his grandmother's words did not explain everything. At least, she did not explain what she said on that night 18 years ago. He slowly raised his head and looked at his grandmother's wrinkled face. In a quiet voice he asked, Grandmother, my mother, how exactly did she die? The old woman paused as if she hadn't thought he would ask this question. After a moment of hesitation, she slowly said, Your father still hasn't told you? Fan Xian smiled weakly. Father has said it, but I still feel that it shouldn't be so simple. Your mother is an extraordinary person. The old woman lovingly patted his cheek. I believe the emperor has already avenged her. As for whether or not there are any enemies left behind, naturally those boys will take care of it. Those boys were the ones who had fought every day in King Cheng's manor. Fan Xian smiled. It looked like his grandmother didn't know the details. Perhaps she didn't want to tell him her guesses. Speaking of which, it was true. For anyone else, he had already received enough compensation from the royal family. Then, why would he be so fixated on the story of the past? Was there a conclusion? Xia, what kind of child is he? The old woman suddenly asked. Fan Xian smiled shortly after. Only now did he remember that ever since his second son was born, he had always lived in Jingdou. He had never even seen his grandmother. He considered his words and slowly said, Xia, perhaps in the past he ran amok. Now that he is gradually getting older, he knows when to stop. Well, tell me about it. It was clear that the old woman was interested in her only grandson. Fan Xian smiled and told her everything about his dealings with Xia after he entered the capital. He didn't even hide the Baoyue brothel incident. This part of the story made the old woman's expression heavy. Occasionally she smiled. You are saying, these two children are running a brothel in Jingdou? The old woman sighed. She thought to herself that she was getting old. No matter what, she couldn't understand the thoughts of these children. But, the third prince is so young. So young yet so full of mischief. Thinking of that matter, Fan Xian was filled with anger. He huffed coldly. The third prince is not just a child. The old woman smiled. Xia is alone in the north. Is he doing well? There were often letters from northern Qi, so Fan Xian was well aware of his second brother's life in the north. He comforted her. Don't worry, I have people there to look after him. The old woman thought for a moment and then said worriedly, after all, it is a foreign country. If Haitang was still in northern Qi's Shangjing, perhaps it would be fine. But right now, there is no one in northern Qi you can trust. It was not convenient for Fan Xian to speak of his secret agreement with the northern Qi emperor. He thought for a moment and then said, don't worry, grandmother. Isn't Ruoruo also in Shangjing right now? She is Master Ku He's last disciple. The northern Qi court will have to give her some face. With her watching, Xizha won't dare do anything when he does things. It was strange to say that Fan Xian had thought of a way to send his sister and brother to northern Qi these 2 years. Minister Fan vaguely guessed some of his intentions but did not expose them. The old woman clearly did not think of it there. She only smiled and said, speaking of Roro, I wonder if her body is better. Much better? There's no more yellow hair on her head. Fan Xian's eyes suddenly turned and he said, Grandmother, come back with me to Jingdo this time, father misses you very much. The old woman was silent for a moment. A moment later she slowly shook her head. Fan Xian sighed. He didn't understand why grandmother always wanted to live in Danzhou. Ruoro is 17 or 18, the old woman said worriedly. She hasn't found a husband yet. You broke up her marriage to Hongqing? Then you have to keep an eye out for people with good character, good family backgrounds and trustworthy families. Fan Xian patted his chest loudly and said, Grandmother, you gave this matter to me to handle. I will definitely handle it properly. Truthfully speaking, he did not think this way in his heart. He thought, Ruoro is so young, why is she in such a rush to marry? Seeing more and walking more was the right thing to do. As he thought this, he completely forgot that when he married Wanner, the two of them were actually not much older than children. As a brother, you have done very well, the old woman looked at Fan Xian warmly and said with praise. The countess looked at Fan Xian warmly and said with praise, you have managed it well. The Fan family is blessed. If your brother and sister can become successful, it will all be because of you. Fan Xian's face reddened. He thought to himself, Ruoruo was so smart that she did not need him to manage her. Xizha's nature had been forcefully twisted by him. In the beginning it had been for his own benefit. As for his ability, even the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall had admitted that Xizha was a genius in business. The conversation between grandmother and grandson, which was kept away from others, came to an end. The old woman hesitantly asked, what about that person? Did he come back this time? The old woman was asking about the blind shopkeeper who had been their neighbor for 16 years. Fan Xian paused for a moment and then understood. With a pained expression, he said, I was going to ask grandmother if she had seen him come back recently. Madame Dowager's expression turned serious. So he's not with you. Then don't go running around like you did this afternoon. Otherwise, if something happens, how can I explain it to His Majesty and your father? Fan Xian mysteriously moved closer to his grandmother's ear and said, don't worry, grandmother. Your grandson is now an ace of aces. The old woman laughed involuntarily. She covered her mouth and said nothing, revealing some of the charm she had many years ago. As they spoke, someone came in from outside to report that the banquet had begun. The grandmother and grandson met each other's eyes with great understanding. Fan Xian held the old woman's arm and walked out. The person who had come to speak was the wife of the Teng family. She lowered her head and led the way in front. Fan Xian looked at her back and suddenly said, has Wanner's medicine been down? The wife of the Teng family tilted her body slightly and quietly replied, the mistress has been taking her medicine on time and in proper amounts. Where is De Bao? How come I don't see him today? Fan Xian was puzzled. He had not seen De Bao come to welcome him. My husband is also here. He didn't know you would arrive early, so he is fishing on the ocean with Master Lin, the wife of the Teng family said with a smile. Fan Xian was delighted and said, Ting Da is also here. Have him come see me in a moment. Yes. The old woman that Fan Xian was supporting suddenly opened her mouth and said, Wanner has been taking medicine recently. I was curious as to what kind of pill it is. Smells pretty good. Fan Xian was startled. He wondered if he should explain this matter to his grandmother. After thinking for a while, he finally smiled warmly. Lowering his voice to a very low level, he told her about Wanner's body and the matter of the child. The old woman fell silent. Her expression did not seem very good. After a long time, she gently coughed and said, Sir is the most important. He is still young, so there is no rush. Fan Xian smiled calmly and said, that is why I like you the most. After the banquet, Fan Xian spoke for a while with Ting Da and asked about the current situation in Jingdo, as well as his father and Lady Lu's health. At the same time, he inquired about some Jingdo market news that the Overwatch Council could not easily access. Fan Xian felt a glimmer of tiredness. After dissuading everyone and greeting his grandmother, he took Wanner back to the bedroom. This bedroom still retained the same appearance as it was a few years ago. None of the furnishings had changed. Fan Xian lay on the bed and watched with slanted eyes as Wanner sat by the table and played with the lantern. He listened to Cece prepare hot water outside the compartment. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Xiaobao, come here." Wanner turned her head and giggled, but a glimmer of shyness flashed across her face. Glancing outside, she angrily said, "Don't you know to be quieter?" The so-called joy of the boudoir was not all in the matters between a man and a woman. Often it was in the small details. The so-called Xiaobao was the secret signal between Fan Xian and Wanner. Small details, small tricks. Wanner was De Bao's sister, so naturally it was Xiaobao. After washing up, Cece smiled and left the door. Just like in the past in Danzhou, she slept on the small bed in the compartment. After the red candles went out, Fan Xian and his wife lay side by side on the bed. Wanner was like a little cat curled up in Fan Xian's arms. Her two hands tightly gripped the front of the man's unlined shirt. She gripped it a bit tightly as if she was afraid someone would run away. "I've been lying on this bed for 16 years. Fan Xian opened his bright eyes in the darkness. "Ever since I was a child, I've always liked to sleep. When I take afternoon naps, I never need the serving girls to coax me. I just sleep like this." Wanner made a sound of acknowledgement and looked at him. Fan Xian lowered his head and gently kissed her plump lips. Indistinctly he said, "But I always feel like I haven't woken up yet. How did I marry such a good wife like you? Am I dreaming?" Lin Wanner closed her teeth and bit him hard. Staring at him fiercely, she said, "Say what you want to say. It's 2F** king hard to write. I'm going to fail. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 435. Fan Xian felt the pain. With a pained expression, he stuck out the tip of his tongue and licked his broken lips. Suddenly he found that there was an additional trace of sweetness. Only now did he know that the anger Wanner had been holding back these few days had all exploded in this bite. He chose his words carefully and said, "It's not that I want to say anything else. I just feel that these days have been hard on you." Lin Wanner turned her body in his embrace and said indistinctly, "Hard on me? I don't have time to keep you company," Fan Xian said after thinking for a bit. Fan Xian thought for a bit and said, "Now that my sister and brother have both gone to Northern Qi and Yi Linger is married, it is impossible for Ro Jia to play with you. Leaving Jingdo, going down to Jiangnan and coming to Danzhou, presumably you don't even have someone by your side to talk to." Before he could finish speaking, Lin Wanner's large eyes gradually became misty. She sighed softly and said, If you don't have a heart, you know all this. If you do have a heart, how can you bear to treat me like this?" Fan Xian's heart grew cold hearing this. He coughed and asked, "How have I treated you? Is that all you want to say?" Lin Wanner looked seriously into his eyes. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then nodded. Lin Wanner smiled coldly and said, "You're starting to be shameless again. In the past, I told you in Jingdo that I wouldn't stop you if you wanted to do anything. In any case, the words of a woman do not have much power. I just hope you can be more honest and tell me before anything happens. Even if I am useless now, I am still the eldest daughter-in-law of the Fan family. Some things cannot be hidden from me." "What are you talking about?" Fan Xian was faintly angry. "How can you be so self-pitying? The Wanner I like is a gentle and mischievous girl." He stopped halfway through his words. On the contrary, it was Wanner who smiled sweetly and said gently, "Why aren't you continuing to lecture me?" Fan Xian coughed and said, "Regardless of whether you believe me or not, I wasn't planning on saying anything else today." "Oh, is that so?" Lin Wanner sighed and said, "Then, when are you going to tell me about Haitang?" Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "It's not the same, it is not the same." After saying this, he hugged Wanner tightly, who had flipped over in a fit of pique. One hand gently tickled her soft waist. He blew into her ear and said, "We've been apart for more than 10 days. What's the point of talking about that?" If it had been Haitang or Ruoruo who had been influenced by Fan Xian's modern feminism, they would have kicked him off the bed. Although Wanner had grown up in the royal palace and had a head full of meticulousness and depth, when it came to matters between men and women, she had received the most traditional education. She said in a muffled voice, "That girl's identity is different. It is already troublesome, but you still act on your own. In the future, who knows what trouble you will stir up. Fan Xian listened to these words that seemed to admit it, but his heart did not relax. On the contrary, a faint apologetic feeling welled up. People, especially men, would be lying if they said that they did not love someone. But it would be a lie if they said that they would love someone for the rest of their life. Admiring jade on the eastern mountain, watching the sunset on the western mountain, doing different things in different places. No one could deceive themselves or brainwash the world. But you stay at home every day and there is no one to play mahjong with you. It is quite boring. Fan Xian did not want to continue on this topic because he suddenly realized that Haitong's position was still that of a friend. That girl might not be willing to marry into the Fan family. Why should he worry about this ahead of time? Why should he make his wife worry and sour with him? The concubines in the palace don't just pass their days like this. Fan Xian's words touched the true weakness in the depths of Lin Wanner's heart. She couldn't help but sigh. She had grown up in the palace. Her mother was the illustrious eldest princess, and her father was Prime Minister Lin. Unfortunately, she had been locked up in the palace and had only seen her parents a few times. It was as if she had been collectively raised by the concubines in the palace. She was smart by nature and had grown up in such an environment. Even if she wasn't exceptionally smart, she at least had a clear understanding of the intrigues and trifles in the field of power. She believed that her ability should have played a greater role. It was only because of her relationship with the eldest princess that Lin Wanner was somewhat averse to scheming and was content with peace. It was also because of the hostile relationship between her husband and mother that Wanner could not have found a suitable place to shine. This was something that she and Fan Xian had discussed a long time ago. If a person could not find a place in their surroundings, they would eventually feel a sense of loss. If she was just an ordinary woman, then she could manage the household, be filial to her parents-in-law, serve her husband and raise a daughter. But Lin Wanner's birth determined that if she continued to be ordinary, she would always feel some regret in her heart. Especially since there were already many people who were beginning to shine at Fan Xian's side. At some point, Lin Wanner was already prepared to accept her fate. She was prepared to hold on to the beautiful memories of having a son over the wall and work hard to give birth to a child for Fan Xian. She wanted to tie her husband's heart to her side. That was why she had taken such a risk and stopped the medicine Fei Jie had prescribed. Fan Xian was a delicate and sensitive person. Of course, he knew the deeper meaning behind his wife's actions. He also knew what the faint worry between his wife's brows these past few months was. However, he still hadn't found a good solution. Fan Xijia's life dream was in business, so Fan Xian could kick him to the north to smuggle. Ruoro's life dream had been influenced by Fan Xian, so Fan Xian could use any method to send her under Ku He's tutelage to travel thousands of li and see different people. But Wanner, her identity was different. She was his wife. Her life dream, or to put it more crudely, what path should she seek to realize her value? The spring examination case as well as some matters before and after, all made Fan Xian understand that Wanner's strength was actually in the palace. In terms of planning, she could indeed help him a great deal. But the problem was at present he and Xingyang were like fire and water. How could he let Wanner be caught in the middle? Fan Xian sighed and said, "If there really comes a day when weapons are used against each other, I really don't know what to do." Such undisguised words were something the husband and wife rarely touched on. They had always avoided this matter. Lin Wanner was silent for a long time and then said, "You know, I don't have much affection for my mother, but after all, she is my mother." "I understand." Fan Xian pressed his nose against her hair and took a deep breath. "Believe me, at least I won't make you sad." Would anyone believe these words? Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and smiled slightly. "Wanner, it is indeed boring to stay at home all the time. I have some things I want you to help me do, but it might be difficult and exhausting." Lin Wanner opened her eyes wide with curiosity. Turning around, she was face to face with him. "What is it?" With a soft fragrance in his arms, Fan Xian hugged his wife and couldn't resist rubbing the fullness a few times. Smiling, he said, "You also know that I am a rich person." "Of course." Lin Wanner couldn't resist smiling. She turned her hand back and slapped the thief's hand. Fan Xian said seriously, "When I went to Jiangnan for the first time last year, I found that although Jiangnan is rich and populous, there are still many commoners who do not have clothes to cover their bodies and food to fill their stomachs. You see, even Jiangnan is like this, much less Jiangbei. There are also the commoners in the middle reaches of the Yangtze who have suffered from floods. They don't know how to survive." Lin Wanner asked curiously, "Didn't you say that the silver you found in the palace treasury has already been transferred to the river transport governor's yamen?" "That is only a portion," Fan Xian said after thinking for a bit. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "You know the affairs of the court better than I do. Not many of those officials can be trusted. If I send the silver to the court, even with the Overwatch Council and Yang Wanli keeping an eye on it, what should flow away will still flow away. Not to mention anything else, at least the Fan family, the Lu family, and even the palace will eat from this silver. So I think, there are some things we can do ourselves." "What things?" "Jiangnan is truly rich. Those rich merchants can take out millions of liang of silver." Fan Xian smiled coldly. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "But there are still so many poor people. This is a problem of inequality." He continued to sigh and said, "I don't have any ability to change this phenomenon. I can only find some mediocre methods to improve it." "You mean?" Lin Wanner guessed her husband's thoughts and said hesitantly, "You are prepared to rob the rich to give to the poor?" Fan Xian laughed loudly. He had not thought that his highborn wife would use the common bandit language from storybooks. He couldn't resist scratching her pretty nose. Wanner stuck out her little tongue and giggled. "But, does this really count as robbing the rich to give to the poor?" Fan Xian thought for a bit and then said seriously, "My thoughts are like this. In any case, we've taken so much silver from the palace treasury and officials, so we have to find a way to use it. Our family can't use it all. As I said earlier, we don't want to go through the path of the court. So, how can we use this silver on the commoners?" Lin Wanner made a sound of acknowledgement and said, "In the past it was common to open a porridge shop and cultivate good deeds. I remember when I was little, there was a disaster in the north. The commoners fleeing from the famine all surged into Jingdo. A few officials in court asked the emperor to send out troops to suppress it and drive these refugees to the nearby provinces. However, Uncle Emperor did not agree to this suggestion. On the contrary, he removed those officials. At the same time, he opened the royal granaries. That year, when we were giving out porridge, the Empress Dowager even brought a few of us from the palace to hold the spoons." Fan Xian nodded. He had heard this story. The emperor was not stupid and knew how to handle it. He said, "Just giving out porridge at the last minute is not enough. Cultivating good deeds is also difficult to spread, so I decided to put the silver I earned into a specialized organization and then do good deeds for many years." He lay in the thin blanket and waved his hand. "When the poor students have no money, they go to the schools we run to study. When there's no rice to eat, we buy rice and distribute it. When there's no seedlings in spring, we give them. In short, we will do whatever the court has not thought of doing." Lin Wanner looked at his confident expression and also became excited. She immediately forced a smile and said, "Idiot, do you know how much silver this will cost? Isn't the silver earned to be spent?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "In any case, what I earn is the silver of the court and the merchants, and the court and the merchants take the silver from the hands of the common people. What is taken from the people, used for the people. This is the logic." Lin Wanner listened to the words, taking from the people and using it for the people, and couldn't help her eyes lighting up. These words are new, but they make sense. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at his wife's worshipful expression. For some reason he thought of last year in the Northern Qi Royal Palace in Shangjing when the Northern Qi Emperor and Haitang Duo heard him shout, "First worry about the worries of the world, then rejoice in the joy of the world." He couldn't help blushing with shame. Unexpectedly, Lin Wanner immediately shook her head seriously. "It still won't work. Putting aside the fact that this is a bottomless pit, no matter how much you throw in, you might not be able to fill it. You have to think thrice about the influence of this matter. For the matters of the court to be snatched by you is a taboo." Fan Xian thought for a bit and then suggested, "Can't I use my name?" Lin Wanner glared at him like she was looking at an idiot. "If I don't use my name, how can such a large scene be set up? It's not like you only want to save the people of a county or a province. If they don't know it's a good deed you're in charge of, won't those local officials rush to take a bite out of this fat piece of meat? So, you have to use your name." Fan Xian thought it made sense. However, he had to use his name and couldn't make the court angry. It was truly difficult. Lin Wanner suddenly opened her mouth and said, "What do you think about using the name of the palace to do this? Using the Empress Dowager's name. In any case, we don't need the nobles in the palace to fork out money. We'll fork out the money and let them bear this name. The court will have light and they will also have face. Presumably the emperor will also be happy." Fan Xian paused and looked at Lin Wanner without saying anything for a long time. He thought to himself that this was indeed the case. With the nobles in the palace stepping out, it would certainly be much easier to carry out. Then wasn't this the so-called general benevolent organization he often saw in his previous life? However, the Qing kingdom was just starting out. Presumably it would be much cruder. However, since there was a beginning, it would improve the lives of the common people. Lin Wanner's interest was piqued and she continued to suggest ideas. But, no matter how rich you are, you won't be able to afford such torment. I think it's better to help the needy and not the poor. The true focus should still be on reading and disaster relief. The daily things to do. Halfway through her words she stopped. Fan Xian also stopped. The two of them looked at each other and then laughed at the same time. There was a glimmer of embarrassment and self-mockery in their laughter. Just what should be done to make the people of the Qing kingdom and even the world live better? This pair of husband and wife were both born with golden spoons in their mouths. How could they know the details? It was just a general discussion. If they really wanted to talk about the specifics, they would only go around in circles on reading and serving porridge. After laughing for a while, Fan Xian said seriously, "We still have to do it. There will always be people who understand these things. Yang Wanli was born poor. Once the matter of the dike has calmed down, we'll summon him to the capital to talk about it." The reforms of his previous life flashed through his mind. Although the Qing Miao and the like looked bright and fresh, Fan Xian knew he did not have the power to change the general situation. He thought to himself that he could only go so and patch things up. Although it was trivial and couldn't change much, it could at least make the lives of the common people a little better. Even if it was just a little, this matter could still be done. In any case, Fan Xian didn't need to worry about it. He only needed to spend some money. "I'll leave this matter to you." Fan Xian looked at Wanner with a smile. Wanner was startled and said, "How can you leave such an important matter to me?" "If you do it, I'm at ease," Fan Xian said with a smile. "Besides, if we want to get the nobles and ladies in the palace to buy shares, if you don't show up, how can it be done? If the women do it, the risk will be less than if I show up. Don't say you're not willing to do it." "Willing?" Hearing this, Lin Wanner was endlessly excited. It wasn't easy to have something to do. How could she miss this opportunity? The husband and wife said a few more words and prepared to do it after some time. During this time, Fan Xian couldn't help but say a few beautiful things like, "It is better to teach a man to fish than to teach a man to fish," which shook Wanner again and again. The couple talked non-stop and, on the contrary, lost their desire to sleep. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Lin Wanner buried her head in his chest and asked in a humming voice. Fan Xian let the cat out of the bag. "Almost half a year." Lin Wanner looked at Fan Xian's pretty face and felt a glimmer of warmth in the depths of her heart. She knew that the majority of the reason Fan Xian was doing this was for her. In reality, in Fan Xian's view, he was doing this completely for Wanner. However, the husband and wife on the bed had not expected that such an organization that had appeared in the world with a flash of inspiration, because Fan Xian controlled too many resources and relied on Wanner's ability, had gradually deviated from their initial ideas and gradually evolved into an organization no one could have predicted. For the world and Fan Xian himself, it had brought many benefits. "Don't put all this silver in one place," Lin Wanner blinked her long eyelashes and said seriously. "Although I don't know anything about economics, from what you and Xia have done, I can understand that money can make money." Fan Xian nodded. Naturally, he would not make it hard for himself in doing these things. The second prince was earning money in the north, and Shi Chanli and Sangwen were in the flesh business in the south. After the large sum of money house property came in, it would become a source of living water. Seeing that Wanner had recovered her bright temperament and knew that she was starting to get excited after having something to do, Fan Xian was also very happy in his heart. The matter he had thought about for so long had finally had the desired effect. What made him most happy was that with this interruption, perhaps those family matters would fade away. Unexpectedly, things did not always go as one wished. Lin Wanner bit her lip and said, "But you still haven't answered me about the matter we talked about earlier." Fan Xian chuckled and pulled her into his embrace affectionately. Vaguely he said, "Don't worry, there won't be anything like this again." It was still that old saying, who could believe a man's words? As expected, Lin Wanner did not believe it. She used her eyes to glance outside and quietly said, "Although Cece has entered the family without a ceremony, it will be unfair to her. I've already talked to grandmother. In a few days we'll have to do it." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Do whatever you want. In any case, she grew up with me, so she probably doesn't care about this." The voices of husband and wife were very quiet. At this moment, the sound of Cece coughing came from the little bed in the outer room. The coughing was full of embarrassment and anger. Lin Wanner gazed at Fan Xian and giggled. "Did you hear that? Who said I don't care?" Fan Xian awkwardly slapped her bottom and said, Usually this girl sleeps like a pig. Why did she wake up so suddenly today? Speaking of sleeping like a pig, Lin Wanner immediately thought of Siki, who had followed her into the Fan Manor. She was also her personal serving girl. Back then in the courtyard she had been charmed by Fan Xian every day. Even if she had not done much, she had worked hard. She furrowed her brows and said, "What about Siki?" Looking at Wanner's expression, Fan Xian knew that this mistress of the household very much wanted her servant girl to also enter the family. However, Fan Xian was truly afraid of these things. Begging for mercy, he said, "Forget it. It's not like I have sex 7 times in one night." Wanner glanced at him faintly and angrily. After a torment, the husband and wife were finally tired. Fan Xian hugged his wife in satisfaction and said by her ear, "Tomorrow I'll take you somewhere." Lin Wanner said in a daze, "Danzhou is not big. I've already seen it all. Where else do we need to go?" Putting aside Fan Xian and his wife's one-day trip to Danzhou, after returning to Danzhou, they would be busy for a while. Fan Xian had enough to deal with just receiving old acquaintances. How could he find time to play? Additionally, one day the grandmother finally presided over the matter. Cici, who had had an accident with Fan Xian on the boat, was finally taken into the room without incident. However, Cici was used to serving Fan Xian, so she could not immediately accept this change in role. She appeared confused and at a loss as to what to do. Regarding this, everyone had long been mentally prepared. Cici had grown up with Fan Xian and their relationship was very good. Many of the servants in the manor still remembered that year, when Fan Xian had stood up for Cici at the age of 12, he had beaten the housekeeper from Jingdo Black and Blue. After the housekeeper was humiliated, he left. However, no news of him was heard afterward. No one knew where he had gone. Furthermore, after Fan Xian went to Jingdo, Danzhou received the news of his marriage. The great ancestor sent Cici to Jingdo. Who didn't know the hidden meaning behind this? Everyone in the Jingdo and Danzhou manors knew that one day Cici would enter the room. However, after it finally happened, other than congratulating Cici, the serving girls in the Count's manor still couldn't help feeling envious and jealous. The old woman gave Cici a large red envelope and spoke warmly for a while. Cici cried loudly and her eyes were red. Even Wanner was wiping away her tears at the side. The next morning, the back door of the Fan Manor was pulled open with a squeak. Fan Xian held Cici's hand and walked out the door sneakily. He turned his head to glance at the girl whose eyes were as red and swollen as peaches. Amused, he said, "Did I bully you or what?" Cici choked and glared at him. In any case, in this manner, she was the only one who dared to be impolite to Fan Xian. She looked at the rising fog in Danzhou and the quiet roads. Unable to resist, she asked curiously, "Young master, where are we going?" Look, she still couldn't change the way she addressed him. Fan Xian held her hand and felt that it was indeed a bit exciting. It was like a clandestine affair. However, they had clearly just openly entered the room yesterday. From this, it could be seen that men were indeed a very despicable animal. A warm smile flashed across his face. "We're going to buy tofu to eat. I recommend the new book, The Last Immortal. Book number 182558. It is very well written. Everyone can go take a look and add it to your collection. Thank you everyone for the honor." To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 436. Early in the morning, Danzhou was quiet. Particularly in the area of the Count's manor, there was no extra sound. Danzhou was not large. Living in the city, one could faintly hear the crowing of chickens in the villages outside the city, but the barking of dogs was nothing. If one listened carefully, they might even be able to hear who was emptying the toilet bowl, who was boiling water for breakfast, and the people in the distant market had already woken up long ago, using fresh vegetables and meat to seduce the women who had woken up early in the morning to cook. On a summer morning the air was fresh. Fan Xian and Cici walked along the quiet streets of the city and came to the side of the familiar market. He sniffed the thickening smell in the air and shook his head in satisfaction. "I haven't come to a place like this much in the past 2 years. Cici glanced at him from the side and thought, as an imperial envoy, he would never have the chance to buy vegetables again. Fan Xian quietly said, "Do you still remember when we were in Danzhou we often came to the market to buy things?" Cici nodded and smiled. "Young master has always wandered around the city with the older sisters since he was young and even helped them carry things. In the beginning you scared many people. I heard about it when I entered the manor and I also thought you were a strange person." "Do you still think I'm strange?" Fan Xian smiled in response and walked into the market first. When he passed by a 2-story building, he unconsciously stopped his steps and turned his body to stare at it. Cici felt it was strange and asked, "What is it?" Fan Xian pointed at the building and said curiously, "Isn't that old Ha's house? Didn't they say the building was burned down? Who lives there now?" Hearing this, Cici also remembered. She tilted her head and thought for a while. Apologetically she said, "I've never heard them mention it." Fan Xian gazed at the newly built 2-story building in a daze. Old Ha, the vegetable delivery man, and the assassin from the Overwatch Council's Dongshan Road had both died here. After the matter, grandmother had people burn this building down to destroy the bodies and all evidence. The people of Danzhou had no idea the truth of this matter and thought it was just a normal fire. His expression calmed. That was 12 years after he came to this world. It was here that he had killed for the first time. The market was in a hubbub. The fisherman on the sea was pushing a cart, silently comparing the price of the first fish of the day with the fishmongers in the field. Meanwhile, the fresh silver fish in the basket on the cart kept bouncing, making popping sounds. From time to time, carts would be pushed in, and the hawkers would yell loudly to make way for them. The vegetable leaves in the second row were stained with dew, delicious and tempting. On the chicken stall in the compartment, the chickens were cackling along with the stench. In the west corner, a big white pig was letting out its last cry under the butcher's knife. There were already many Danzhou commoners who had come to buy vegetables and food. They had to hurry early to buy the freshest vegetables. The customs of the people of Danzhou were simple. Additionally, the Qing emperor had been especially kind to the people, giving them generosity year after year. Thus the people lived well. At least they could afford to eat meat every day. Seeing this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. The kingdom of Qing was not bad. After walking a few steps, he came to the quietest corner of the market. Looking at the figure in the distance at the tofu stall, Fan Xian stopped walking. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the familiar curve of a waist, the young woman's rosy face, and her slightly well-rounded body. He smiled warmly and thought to himself, "I've been carried by her since I was a child, but I still can't get tired of looking at her." Cici looked at the woman and smiled happily. She prepared to run in that direction. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian grabbed her hand. She glanced back with confusion. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Why must we meet? It's fine to look from afar." Looking at Donger's expression, her days should be good. Let's not disturb her. Cici didn't understand. Since she had sneaked out, was she really not going to meet him? Was she just going to stupidly look from afar? The manor gives her a monthly stipend. This is what I want. Fan Xian seemed to be comforting himself. With this money, she should have no problems living. The young woman selling tofu was called Donger. Back in the day, she had been a serving girl in the count's manor in Danzhou. This woman had begun to carry Fan Xian when she was 10 and had carried him until he was 10. Their relationship was not ordinary. However, by the time Fan Xian was 10, the girl was getting older. Additionally, Fan Xian knew that his future life would be very dangerous. Thus, he found an excuse to chase her out of the manor. He only continued to help her in secret. He liked Donger, so he wanted to arrange a normal and happy life for Donger. However, it seemed that a normal and happy life did not come so easily. Fan Xian and Cici watched for a while. Suddenly, they saw 4 or 5 large men surrounding Donger's tofu stall. They were excitedly talking about something. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed, and a glimmer of coldness flashed across his delicate face. Although the men were agitated, they did not seem to be overbearing, nor did they do anything too excessive, so for the time being, he did not go berserk. He indicated for Cici to follow him closer to the tofu stall. Hearing their conversation clearly, he also saw the wrinkles at the corners of Donger's eyes. Involuntarily, his heart darkened. "Donger, it's not that we're forcing you. It's just that this debt has already dragged on for a year. It should be paid, right?" The leading man furrowed his brows and said, "Go ask around. The money we've given you is already the most generous kind. There's no longer such a low interest rate." Donger rubbed her hands helplessly. Her hands had been soaked in tofu water for a long time. They were a little red and rough. She lowered her head and said awkwardly, "Just a few more days, just a few more days. You know that my husband's health hasn't been good this year. His illness has cost a lot of money." The large man glanced at her and suddenly said, "I say, Dong, how can you be so unreasonable?" Donger raised her head in confusion. The burly man chuckled and said, "Let's not talk about anything else. This city deputy Guan has always collected the least money from you. Our boss also didn't ask you for a high interest rate. Everyone in the market respects you. Why is that? Isn't it because you came from the Count's manor? Although on the surface you were chased out of the manor, which of us old people in Danjo doesn't know? The young master of the Fan family loves you the most. When you were little he always hung out at your tofu stall to play. He cleared his throat and said, "We all give young Master Fan face and no one dares to bully you, but..." He suddenly said angrily, "This silver isn't much. You can just go to the Count's manor and say a few words to the old madam. Won't she help you?" Donger pressed her lips together tightly and refused to say another word. The large man finally couldn't resist and said, "Even if you don't dare to go and tell the old madam, everyone now knows about the major matter in the Danjo government. The young master of the Fan family has already returned to his hometown. He is now an imperial envoy. If he casually takes care of you, your entire family will soar. Why would he care about this silver?" Dong-er suddenly raised her head and said with a resolute expression, "Don't disturb the mansion about my matters. I will naturally repay you the money I owe you slowly. Big brother Hu, thank you for taking care of me these past 2 years. Dong-er is very grateful." However, these words clearly had no effect. Although the large man didn't dare to threaten Dong-er, he still needed to rely on this to earn money. He angrily said, "Since you say you don't have any friendship with the manor, then we won't be polite. Give me the silver you deserve today." Hearing this, Fan Xian finally understood the reason of the matter and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Donger's mother was probably not in good health, but the money he had the manor send over every month should be enough. Looking at Donger's expression, she probably hadn't been willing to use the silver he had sent over these 2 years and was only willing to rely on this tofu stall to barely make ends meet. There was no need to continue listening. Fan Xian also didn't have the hobby of waiting for the situation to intensify before coming out to be a boss, even though it was clear that he was currently the most powerful boss in Danjo. He nodded his head at Cece. Cece immediately understood. She took a few quick steps and arrived in front of the tofu stall. Looking at the large men, she calmly asked, "How much do you need?" The large men were clearly startled by the sudden appearance of this girl. Although Cece didn't deliberately dress up when she went out today, she lived in a wealthy family every day. The clothes and decorations on her body were all luxurious. The large men had sharp eyes and knew that this girl's background was not ordinary. They coughed lightly and respectfully said, "It's only 10 liang of silver." As they spoke, the eyes of these burly men floated around the tofu shop. When Donger saw Cece standing in front of her tofu stall, she was already stunned. A moment later, a helpless smile appeared on her flushed face. The leader of the group suddenly glanced at the young master standing behind the tofu shop. Looking at the young master's delicate and pretty face, and then thinking about the background of the tofu shop owner, Donger, and the beautiful lady in front of him, he immediately guessed the young master's identity. He hurriedly added in a trembling voice, "It is indeed 10 taels of silver. This interest, I didn't dare to charge it too much. Since Lady Dong-er is here today, it will naturally be completely waived." Cece's face was full of smiles. She turned her head to glance at Donger and said, "Sister, is it this much?" Donger was still immersed in shock and nodded her head in a panic. Cece glanced at Fan Xian. Of course this girl knew what Fan Xian was thinking. She smiled at the large men and said, "I can also see that you all have intentions of protecting my sister. I thank you for this intention on behalf of my young master." As she spoke, she took out a small silver note from her sleeve and handed it over. Warmly she said, "In the future, help me look after this shop." The large man took the silver note and looked. It was a 20 denomination. He couldn't help but want to return it with a pained expression. However, he then glanced at the young man's face behind the tofu stall, his emotions unknown. He didn't dare to say anything more. In a trembling voice he said, I wouldn't dare. Of course. After saying this, he quickly pulled the confused subordinates behind him and hurriedly left. When he passed by Fan Xian, he bowed deeply to the ground and didn't even dare to let out a fart. Fan Xian shook his head and walked into the tofu stall. Facing Donger, who still didn't believe her eyes, he complained, "You have money and don't use it. Why did you borrow expensive interest?" Donger forced a smile and glanced at him. In a quiet voice she said, "Young master, why have you come?" Fan Xian angrily said, "It was the same a few years ago and it's still the same now. You are my servant girl. Can't I come to see you?" To the side, Cece covered her mouth and laughed. I wonder who it was just standing there and not coming over. Having said this, she walked to Donger's side and affectionately held her hand. Dong, Was a little flustered as she rubbed her hands on the cloth in front of her. She smiled warmly. Fan Xian fixed his gaze on Dong Er's face and looked more closely at the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. Time was merciless. It had not left too deep a mark on the young woman's face. However, the daily chores and small business always made her appear tired. Particularly when he was standing next to Cici, and compared to Cici, a servant girl who lived like a prince, he appeared even more uncomfortable. Fan Xian sighed. Suddenly he didn't know what to say. With a serious expression he asked, "Where is the little girl?" "She's at home with her father. Her father is not well." Dong Er glanced at Fan Xian's expression and smiled warmly. She had raised Fan Xian and knew what he was thinking. She could also guess why he was unhappy. In a quiet voice she said, "I don't dare to use the money young master sent carelessly. In any case it can be used too." Without waiting for her to finish, Fan Xian waved his hand angrily and said, "Take me to your house to sit and talk." Dong Er glanced at her tofu stall and was so embarrassed she didn't know what to say. Fan Xian angrily said, "Why do you care about such a broken stall? Back then I messed it up. What ordinary life. If you had always been with me, you wouldn't have to suffer such filthy air." Seeing his anger, Dong Er didn't say anything more. Cici went forward to hold her hand and walked out of the market. Fan Xian walked out of the tofu stall behind the two of them. He glared coldly at the gazes that were focused on him from all around the market. After thinking for a bit, he picked up the 2 pieces of tofu that he had finished making in his hands. Only then did he leisurely stroll out. After he left, the entire market exploded into noise like a frying pan. At this time, all of the peddlers recognized who he was and couldn't help but sink into shock and excitement. The imperial envoy had come to the market. What wonderful gossip it was, particularly when there was the servant girl of the past, the tofu beauty of the present, and other such guesswork. "Did you see that? I told you, young Master Fan is someone who cherishes old friendships. Since he has returned to Danzhou, naturally, he will come to see Sister Dong Er." Someone clicked their tongue and sighed. Imperial Envoy, how high of an official must he be to still be so nostalgic? Someone gossiped and someone scolded back, "Don't you see that Sister Cici is also here? If you dare to spout nonsense again, be careful that someone from the manor will send you to the west to fight the Hu people." Regardless of how the discussion in the market fermented, the might of the Fan Manor was here. Fan Xian's reputation was here. Some rumors without a head or tail naturally died without any cause. However, Fan Xian's sudden arrival and the sudden closure of the tofu shop injected a glimmer of the liveliness of the already lively market in the morning. No one thought that there would be no tofu to eat in Danzhou today. Dong Er's home was in a small courtyard in a remote part of Danzhou. It was quietly hidden in the depths of a small alley. Although such an independent courtyard was common in Danzhou, it was still worth a lot of money. It had been bought by Fan Xian on the day of Dong Er's marriage using the money from selling the internal court newspaper Pan Ling's calligraphy. At the time, Fan Xian had put in a lot of effort. Dong Er did not dare disobey the wishes of the 11-year-old young master and had lived there until today. However, the decorations in the courtyard were somewhat old. Fan Xian walked into the courtyard and looked around. He found that it was relatively clean and tidy. Nodding his head with satisfaction, he placed the 2 squares of tofu in his hands on the stone grinder. Putting his hands behind his back, he entered the main hall. Dong Er was busy pouring tea and taking out snacks. Fan Xian stopped her and smiled. "It's not like you don't know my temper. I don't like to eat those things." Dong Er smiled warmly and said, "At that time, everyone in the manor said that the young master was a strange child. A child who didn't like to eat snacks but liked to gnaw on bones." "Yes, a strange child." Fan Xian sighed and said, "Only you don't think I'm strange." Cici randomly wiped at the low couch. She knew that Fan Xian didn't care about such things, so she invited him to sit. Fan Xian shook his head and lifted the curtain on the left side of the main hall. Without any awkwardness he charged in. Entering the room, he saw a man about 30 years old struggling to get up from the bed. The man's features were regular and had a sense of loyalty. However, his face was a bit pale. It looked like his health was not very good. Seeing Fan Xian go into the room, Dong Er jumped up in panic and quickly followed him in. "Young master, this is where the sick stay. What are you doing in here?" The man on the bed was Dong Er's husband. His surname was Mai. He had long guessed the identity of the visitor. Ever since he knew that the young master of the Fan family was returning to Danzhou, he had been discussing with Dong Er whether or not the young master of the Fan family would come to visit. After all, the difference in their statuses was too great. Thinking that this matter was very unlikely, The two of them relaxed and did not make any preparations. "Young Master Fan, don't come in," he said in a panic. He was quite frightened. Fan Xian smiled and directly sat down by his side. One hand felt his pulse and used his gaze to indicate for him to calm down. Donger stood at the door and guessed that the young master was treating her husband. She couldn't help but feel a glimmer of doubt. Back in the manor, she had seen the young master holding up a medical book and reading it. However, even the doctors in the city said it was difficult to treat this illness. Her husband was even more nervous. Seeing Fan Xian's finger feel his pulse, he thought to himself that this was the present imperial envoy. According to the rumors, he was a dragon. How could he treat him? He was endlessly excited and moved. His eyes began to moisten. The room was silent. Cici did not enter the room. She just watched carefully from behind Donger. After a long time, Fan Xian released his finger and opened his eyes. Smiling slightly, he said, "What a coincidence, it is a problem of the lungs. It is easy to treat." Hearing these words, Donger and her husband were overjoyed, but they still did not believe it. Cici covered her mouth and smiled. "Don't worry, the young mistress also has a problem of the lungs. Even the imperial doctors in the palace could not cure it. It was all cured by the young master." Writing this chapter, I thought of Shirin, Baoyu and Songzier. Donger and Fan Xian are much stronger than those two sesame seed cakes. I've been so happy writing recently. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 437. After hearing Cici's words, Donger and her husband couldn't help but be overjoyed. When they thought about how this illness had caused their family to suffer over the past year, Donger couldn't help but lift her sleeve and carefully wipe the corners of her eyes. Fan Xian had Donger prepare a brush and ink. After thinking for a moment, he wrote down a prescription and looked it over twice. After confirming there were no problems, he blew it dry and gave it to her. He told her to prepare the medicine on time and not be stingy with the silver. Donger smiled slightly and agreed. Fan Xian looked at her expression and knew that this sister might not listen to his words. He couldn't resist getting angry again and said, "What reason is there for me to make myself suffer?" Donger only smiled gratefully and didn't reply to him. Fan Xian was angry. The weather was hot, and Fan Xian only wore an unlined garment. He was also in Danzhou, so he wasn't worried, so he didn't bring the medicine box with him. He said to Cici, "When we go back tonight, remember to remind me to pick up a few pills." He then turned his head to Donger's husband and said warmly, "My Shiner, you have to take this medicine often. However, I don't think Danzhou will have enough medicine. When I return to Jingdo in a few days, your family will come with me. After all, you are the head of the family. I have to ask for your opinion first and see if there is anything in Danzhou that you can't let go of." My Shiner opened his mouth wide and was speechless for a long time. He knew what the young master meant. His family would follow the young master to the capital. How could they have a hard time? But, he coughed twice and looked at Donger with an inquiring gaze. Cici watched coldly from the side and couldn't resist smiling slightly. Her young master's personality was like this. When he met a woman close to him, he couldn't be forceful. He also couldn't force Donger to do anything, so he could only act on Brother Mai. How could Donger not know what Fan Xian meant? She sighed and said, "The young master has written a prescription, so it must be good. I promise you I will never borrow money again. These years you have sent home over 100 liang of silver, and I promise you that I will use it all. In Danzhou, 100 liang of silver is enough to live a good life. Don't worry." Cici looked at Fan Xian's expression and encouraged him from the side. "That pill can't be made even with money. Even if the young master found a medicine shop in Jingdo and made it, would he have time to travel thousands of li to deliver it to you?" Donger looked at her awkwardly and said, "What kind of pill would require so much effort?" To the side, Fan Xian shook his head and said with a smile, "Do you still remember that ugly teacher in the manor?" When Donger heard this, she immediately thought of his messy hair and eyes that shone with green light like those of a hungry wolf. She subconsciously shivered and covered her mouth in disgust. "What is Mr. Timothy doing? Back then we were afraid of him. This medicine was concocted by Mr. Fei." Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "Although he was born in an ugly family, you should know that he is the famous Sir Fei Jia of the Qin kingdom." Donger sank into shock. It was not until today that she knew that the teacher who had looked like a pervert had such an important identity. Thinking of the young master's past, she could accept it more easily. Fan Xian turned and smiled slightly at Donger's husband. Prepare to go with me to the capital. Dong Er's husband was loyal and honest, but he did not have his own opinions. Hearing Fan Xian's resolute and decisive words, he unconsciously made a sound of assent. However, Dong Er huffed coldly and glared at him. My Shiner quickly shut his mouth. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. It looked like in this family Dong Er was the one with the most power. Rest well and recover. What are you worrying about? Dong Er yelled angrily at her man. Rising, she pulled Fan Xian and Cici out of the bedroom and sat down in the middle of the hall. They drank some tea and chatted a bit. However, no matter how strict Fan Xian was, Dong Er remained stubborn and silent when it came to the suggestion of going to Jingdo. She refused to open her mouth and agree. Fan Xian looked at the woman's expression and couldn't help but sigh. He thought to himself that such a gentle sister also had such a stubborn side. A few coughs came from the bedroom. Fan Xian tilted his ear to listen and lowered his voice. Gently he said, Sister Dong Er, before you got married, I took you to secretly see Brother Mai. You liked him, so I didn't pay attention to this matter. Back then I also asked clearly. Brother Mai's parents died when he was young. He is a loyal and honest person. In Danzhou he also doesn't have any troublesome relatives. Presumably he will treat you well after marriage. Only then did I relax. This was the truth. When Sister Dong Er got married, Fan Xian was not more than 11 years old. However, he had secretly observed for a long time before he was at ease to promise his serving girl to the Mai family. Dong Er rubbed her reddened hands nervously and said shyly, He treats me well now, how bad can the person you like be? Since you don't have any relatives in Danzhou, why aren't you willing to go with me to Jingdo? I made a mistake back then, Fan Xian recalled. Fan Xian thought back and said, If I left you outside, these days might not be any more peaceful. Without waiting for Dong Er to speak, he continued, Don't worry, I will take care of you in Jingdo. You can continue to open your tofu shop. However, with you by my side we can look after each other. Fan Xian did not need Dong Er to look after him. The meaning of these words was clear. Cici also urged from the side, Yes, Sister Dong Er. Did you know that after the young master went to Jingdo, the first business he opened was a tofu shop? Nowadays all the manners in Jingdo are eating our tofu. Fan Xian's brows moved and he smiled bitterly. He thought, why did the words she said sound so awkward? Cici smiled and continued, If you go, won't this tofu sell even better? Dong Er hesitated for a moment and then said, Actually, I understand what the young master means and am grateful. However, I really don't want to go to Jingdo. What? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Dong Er thought for a bit. A warm smile suddenly flashed across her face. She slowly said, After living in Danzhou for a long time, who wants to leave their home? Besides, although Jingdo is good, the place is too big. I'm afraid I'll panic if I go. Besides, I don't want to trouble the young master to always look after me. There are no demons in Jingdo, what's there to panic about? Cici muttered to the side. Dong Er covered her mouth and smiled. Who's like you, little girl? You've been so daring since you were little. As they spoke, a childish voice suddenly rang out from outside the courtyard. Dong Er's expression suddenly became increasingly gentle. She stood, walked to the door and looked out. At this time, the sun had already risen to the middle of the sky. The blazing sunlight brushed past the edge of the eaves and shone on the woman's still beautiful face. The light suddenly became gentle, and the woman's expression seemed so peaceful and content. The little girl who had been playing outside had returned. Dong Er led her daughter into the room. Pointing at Fan Xian sitting in the middle, she said, Call him young master. Fan Xian looked at the little girl held by Dong Er's hand. A genuine smile rose to his face. In the blink of an eye, 2 years had passed. The girl's eyes had already opened up. She had inherited her mother's elegance and was beginning to be eye-catching. The childishness between her brows made one feel pity for her. Particularly, her spirited and lively eyes were staring curiously at him. Call him uncle. Fan Xian reached out and pulled the little girl into his arms. Looking at her nervous and uneasy, he smiled and said, We haven't seen each other for a few years. How come you don't recognize me? The little girl raised her face and looked at Fan Xian's beautiful face. She tilted her head and thought for a moment. Suddenly she giggled and said, Uncle, where did you go to play? Just as Fan Xian had been raised by Dong Er, Fan Xian often hung out at the tofu shop when he was young. He had also carried this child countless times. Furthermore, he doted on and loved her. He often bought little things for her. Thus, the little girl had a deep impression of this uncle. Although she was still young, she remembered it clearly. She's 9, right? Fan Xian asked Dong as he studied the little girl's face in his arms. Dong smiled warmly and said, "You have a good memory, young master. She'll be 10 in a few months." Fan Xian looked at the large cloth bag on the little girl's body. Lifting her above his head, he weighed her. Satisfied, he said, "Your body is not weak. However, a little girl shouldn't go out and play all day. She's so young. Dong don't let her do things. It's hard on our girl." Dong smiled and said, "How could I bear to let her do things? She just came back from school." Fan Xian turned to look at her curiously and put the little girl down. The little girl obediently bowed to Cece. Only then did Cece pinch the little girl's cheeks with heartache. She took out the gift that Fan Xian had prepared and placed it in the little girl's hands. The little girl looked at her mother. Having received permission, she happily accepted the gift. As she rubbed her slightly aching face, she said to her mother, "Mother, I'm going to brew some medicine for father." Dong looked at her pitifully and nodded. The little girl skipped happily into the inner room with the gift in her hands. Looking at this scene in addition to the previous sentence, Fan Xian suddenly saw Dong in a new light. To be able to raise such a sensible child, Dong was truly not simple. Although many noble young ladies in the Qing kingdom would go to the family school to study when they were young, and there were even private schools for girls in the capital, among the common people the status of girls was still very low. As for going to school, that was something that had never been heard of. For Dong to be able to let her own daughter go to school, her boldness was not something an ordinary girl could compare to. Fan Xian looked at her and said in praise, "You've done well. This child must continue to study." Dong smiled warmly. After thinking for a while, she said, "It's just that she is a girl. Although she knows that learning to read and understand is always good, I don't know what to do in the future." "What to do?" Fan Xian laughed. "With me, her uncle, here she can do whatever she wants under the sky." This was a promise. Dong was overjoyed, but she knew that the young master did not like her bowing, so she only looked at him gratefully. Fan Xian then said seriously, "Don't make random marriage arrangements. Even if you want to marry, you have to let me know first." Dong smiled contentedly and nodded. As they chatted, it was time for lunch. Dong said awkwardly, "Young master, please sit for a while. I'll go prepare." Fan Xian knew that if he ate at her house, there would certainly be a lot of noise. He might even have to borrow some ingredients from the neighbors, so he quickly stopped her. "Of course we have to eat at your house, but don't make it so troublesome. We'll just eat the tofu rice you used to make in the past." Dong suddenly made a sound and held her forehead angrily. "I haven't even ordered the starch yet. If it's left in the shop, I'm afraid it won't be edible." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Did you forget that I brought 2 plates?" After busying themselves, Dong husband was also helped out of the bedroom by the little girl. Although he had not used the medicine that Fan Xian had made, during the diagnosis earlier, Fan Xian had already sent a streak of Tianyi Dao's natural jinqi into him, so my Miao's spirit was clearly much better. Everyone in the house gathered around the Kong and ate a lively meal of tofu rice. Dong's family of 3 couldn't help but feel apologetic and uncomfortable, but Fan Xian ate happily. Earlier, when he saw Dong's motherly appearance as she sat by the door, he knew that Dong's life could still continue to be happy and that she didn't necessarily have to follow him to Jingdo. "Uncle, is Jingdo fun?" the little girl asked curiously with wide eyes. She held a large rice bowl and used her long chopsticks to dig at the soft tofu rice. "Jingdo is not fun." Fan Xian put down the bowl and looked at the little girl seriously. "It's very not fun, but if we don't go play, how would we know? Do you want to go see Uncle in the future?" "Yes," the little girl said excitedly. Returning to the Count's manor, he told Wan about what happened that day. Wan listened to Fan Xian's narration and couldn't stop her eyes from turning red. When she heard that Dong insisted on not going to Jingdo, she felt even more respect for her. Once outside, Fan Xian stretched lazily, rubbed his somewhat full belly and gently clapped his palms. A shadow slowly emerged from the sunlight beside the pillar. The tiger guards now knew Fan Xian's temper and his strength, so they didn't follow him closely like they had in the past. Only this shadow, after chasing back the 9th-level swordsman from Dongyi, became a maggot attached to Fan Xian's bones. Fan Xian tilted his head to look at him and said, "Following me like this every day, isn't it annoying?" The shadow thought about it seriously for a while and said, "It is indeed very annoying." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Isn't it annoying to follow a cripple?" The shadow replied straightforwardly, "There are beautiful women by the cripple's side." Fan Xian was speechless and shook his head helplessly. "You saw it today. What do you think about my ex-owner's illness? Since there were no signs before, his body is good. He shouldn't have gotten such a serious illness, the shadow said in a low voice. He should have suffered an external injury and then contracted the disease. Fan Xian nodded silently. This judgment was very close to the situation he had personally found in the clinic. A moment later, he calmly said, "It is not convenient for me to ask them about this in person. Given Dong Er's outwardly smooth but inwardly square temperament, I'm afraid he won't say it. There is no one in Danzhou who dares not to give me face, so this matter is probably a misunderstanding. Go investigate and teach them a lesson. Don't let them die." Fan Xian set a boundary and calmly said, "If they were kicked, you should also kick them. Kick them until they can't get out of bed for 3 years." The shadow tilted his head to look at him. A moment later he said, "You want me to kick people?" His tone was a bit strange. Indeed, this was the leader of the Overwatch Council's assassin gang, the most powerful assassin in the world. Would Fan Xian order him to kick people because of a small matter in a remote province? "You are the best in the world when it comes to killing people." Fan Xian smiled warmly and patted his shoulder. "Presumably your ability to kick people is also not bad. Thank you for your hard work." The shadow had nothing to say and sank back into the darkness. Coming to his grandmother's bedroom, he followed the customs of previous years and properly bowed to greet her. He then told her what had happened when he went to see Dong. Fan Xian knew that in a place like Danzhou, there was nothing that could be hidden from his grandmother, so he felt vaguely uncomfortable in his heart. His grandmother should know what he was thinking. How could she bear to let her serving girl suffer such filthy treatment in the city? Even her husband had been bullied to the point of lying in bed. Looking at Fan Xian's expression, the old woman knew what he was thinking. She smiled and said, "You resent me in your heart? I wouldn't dare." Although Fan Xian said this, his tone was a bit stiff. The old woman looked at her grandson's rare expression of anger and couldn't resist laughing. She explained the whole story. For some reason, the son of the previous governor had taken a liking to Dong. However, that son was not an idiot. Of course, he would not use force in Danzhou in front of the count's manor. He would only go to the tofu shop and pester her shamelessly. Donger had been pestered to the point where she couldn't do anything, but he didn't use any despicable methods, so she could only endure. Although a woman could endure, a woman's man could not. Maiger finally exploded out of his little universe and gave the son a good beating. After all, the son's father was the current governor. Although Donger's husband's body was sturdy, he was no match for a crowd of fists. He was knocked to the ground and sent to prison. It was only because the old woman spoke that the governor did not continue to pester him. Because of this, Maiger was kicked in the chest and suffered some damp and cold air in the prison. He fell ill and lay in bed the entire time. Listening to his grandmother's narration, Fan Xian's expression was calm. Now that he knew the cause of this matter, he also understood why Donger was silent. In the end, it was Maigu who made the first move. Furthermore, although the people of Danzhou knew of his relationship with Donger's family, in the eyes of the people of the world, even in his grandmother's eyes, Dong-er was just a servant girl who had long been kicked out of the family. She was a servant, while the other was the son of the governor. The difference in social class was always there. With such an outcome, the people of Danzhou would not feel that the Fan Manor had done anything wrong. On the contrary, they would feel that the Fan Manor had helped Dong-er's family greatly. However, Fan Xian would not think this way. In his heart, the division of people was never based on social class. It was only based on closeness. The old woman looked at his thoughtful expression and couldn't resist opening her mouth to ask, "What is it?" "Nothing." Fan Xian raised his head with a smile. "I'll have someone go and kick that son." The old woman started and immediately smiled. "Then go ahead and kick him as you please. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 438. After some small talk, Fan Xian took the opportunity to once again bring up the suggestion of asking grandmother to come with him to Jingdo to retire. Just like that night, the old woman used her silence to express her attitude. Fan Xian couldn't resist sighing and said, "Why don't you all want to go?" The old woman knew he was talking about Donger's family and smiled. "Living in Jingdo is not easy. Furthermore, Donger is so close to you. Don't forget, the girls at your side have all been taught by you to have their hearts higher than the sky. They are unyielding and ruthless, and no one is as easy to deal with." Fan Xian started and rubbed his head. He thought that this was indeed the case. Xiaoya, who was still in the manor, was the youngest of those who had followed him. Looking at her mouth, she was also a ruthless and unforgiving character. There was also Xiaoqing, who had brought her man back to the manor to see him a few days ago. Xiaoqing's man was a scholar with scholarly honors. In the end, in front of Xiaoqing, he didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. Xiaoqing and Xiaoya were like this, not to mention Donger and the usually impudent Cici. The girls in the manor had truly been spoiled rotten by him and had been taught badly. Where they were placed, they were all unyielding characters and didn't care about the rules of this world. Although they all appeared gentle on the outside, their hearts were clear. As Fan Xian thought about it, he smiled with some self-satisfaction. Even if he couldn't change much in this world, he had at least changed the thoughts and lives of a few women. It was not bad. Of course, it was only the girls who followed him that could have such benefits. If they didn't have him behind them with the temper of these 4 girls, it would probably be difficult for them to move an inch in this world. A night without words. The next day, a piece of news came from Danzhou. It said that the young master of a certain manor had been forcefully kicked and spat up a number of bowls of blood. He had urgently found a doctor to save him and was lying in bed moaning. No one had seen the culprit, and Danzhou had always been a simple place with good public order. The people were honest and dutiful without a trace of banditry. They had never heard of a young master of a noble family being beaten up like this. The entire Danzhou was shocked. The Zhizhou was furious. He was prepared to investigate this case carefully and give the previous teacher a great deal of face. However, when the advisor moved close to his ear and said a few words, the Zhizhou immediately calmed down and returned to his Jingxinzhai to drink tea. The clever people of Danzhou slowly guessed the reason for this matter. No one dared to discuss it too much. The residence of the young master who had been beaten up was filled with hatred and resentment, but he didn't dare to cry out to the rest of the world. Instead, he respectfully sent someone to Dong Er's courtyard to hand over the medical fees and compensation for the past 2 years. The matter died down very quickly. The people of Danzhou knew that the young master of the Fan family was not someone who liked to cause trouble. He was just someone who protected his own people, so they were not too worried. After a few more days, a secret edict from Jingdo and a report from Jiangnan were sent at the same time to the count's manor. Fan Xian lowered his head to look at the 2 thin pieces of paper. He knew that his trip to Danzhou had come to an end. Involuntarily, a glimmer of reluctance welled up in his heart. After all, he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and an imperial envoy with full power in Jiangnan Road. Furthermore, he was still young and healthy. He could not follow Qin Pingping and hide away in his favorite place to retire. Although Danzhou was good, he would eventually have to leave. In the morning of the next day, Teng Zijing took Lin de Bao and the 3rd prince out to sea to fish again. Fan Xian had finally fulfilled his promise to Wan. Holding her little hand, the 2 of them used their slow steps to step on the Danzhou soil. Feeling the atmosphere, they carried out an enriching one-day tour of Danzhou. After a little disguise, the husband and wife went to the lively market, went to the beach by the pier, looked at the beautiful white birds that Hong Changqing hated bitterly, squatted at the back door of the count's mansion and told stories for a while. Only then did they go to the extremely quiet grocery store. Wan smiled warmly the entire way and allowed her husband to hold her hand as they walked quickly or slowly. She knew that all of these were Fan Xian's most beautiful memories. He had brought her here today in the hope that she could also share in the most gentle and beautiful part of his heart. The grocery store was quiet. The dust was still thick. The couple were both lazy people, so they couldn't be bothered to clean up. They just stood in the room and looked around, talking about old times. Wan listened quietly to Fan Xian reminiscing about his childhood with a myriad of emotions. Her heart couldn't help but tremble. She thought that it was not only her life in the royal palace that had been tense and dangerous. Even her husband's childhood, other than happiness, also had many hardships and hardships. Her hand gently held the kitchen knife. Smiling slightly, she said, "Then I will use this knife to cut the shredded radish for you to drink?" Fan Xian smiled happily and nodded his head. Wan glared at him and said, "Drinking sorghum at such a young age, aren't you afraid of getting drunk to death?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. Lin Wan suddenly opened her large eyes and said curiously, "Where is the cliff you practice martial arts on? Is it like the steep slope on Song Mountain? Can you take me there to see?" Fan Xian was startled and said, "That place is dangerous. You can't go up." Lin Wan made an "oh" sound, but her round face clearly expressed a strong sense of regret. Fan Xian looked at her and suddenly said, "Hold me tightly." Lin Wan paused for a moment and then chuckled. Her hands passed through Fan Xian's arms and hugged him tightly, just like that night on the bed. She was afraid that he would disappear, and she was even more afraid that he would be immersed in the atmosphere of Danzhou. On the precipitous cliff by the Danzhou Sea, Fan Xian and Lin Wan stood hand in hand on the edge of the cliff. A few steps forward was the abyss, the ocean, and the snowflakes. The sea wind blew against their faces. The sun above their heads seemed a bit further away than it did on the ground. It was clear and scattered with a layer of light, but it did not seem very hot. Wan'er's breathing was slightly chaotic. Her face was flushed, but there was a slight fear in her eyes. Being carried up the cliff by Fan Xian was truly the most exciting experience of her life. She didn't know how she had gotten up those wet and slippery cliffs. So, standing at the edge of the cliff, she was actually not afraid. It was as if she was numb. She timidly glanced at Danzhou in the distance and found that even with her eyesight, she couldn't even see the appearance of the private residences clearly. She turned her head and glanced at the calm Fan Xian. In a quiet voice she said, "In the past, climbing every day?" "Yes," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "Since I was 6 or 7? I can't remember anymore. In any case, other than me and Uncle, you are the third person to come up here." Lin Wan'er lowered her head and stuck out her tongue. She knew that this must be Fan Xian's greatest secret. To be able to be brought up by him, a glimmer of sweetness welled up in her heart. Immediately after, there was a glimmer of bitterness. She slowly leaned against Fan Xian's arm and said, "I always felt that my life in the royal palace was hard. Only now do I know that your life is even harder than mine." At such a young age he was forced to climb mountains. What was it for? Naturally he was worried that someone would come and kill him. To grow up in such a terrifying environment, what kind of torture was that for the boy back then? Thinking of this, Wan'er felt a glimmer of sympathy for the seemingly incomparably powerful man beside her. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "What is so hard about it? If you don't want to die, you have to work harder. Actually, compared to other people in this world, you and I are already people who have been soaked in a secret jar. Don't say it's hard lightly. At least we don't have to worry about whether we'll have food to eat, clothes to wear, or whether our parents will sell us to a brothel to be a prostitute or a teapot." Wan'er listened calmly to the side. The carefree energy on the surface is all faked. Fan Xian looked at the golden light on the surface of the sea in a daze. "Actually, you should know that I can be said to be the person who lives the most attentively, the hardest, and the most diligent in this world." Wan'er nodded. Even during the years in the Tsang Mountains after his marriage, Fan Xian did not forget to cultivate twice a day. Given Fan Xian's present realm and power, he did not need to be so diligent. People often only saw Sir Fan Jr.'s bright and beautiful side. They had no idea how much sweat and effort he had put into this side. "I've been like this since I was very young," Fan Xian slowly said. "No one understands why I treat myself so harshly." Wan'er only understood one thing, so she listened quietly to him. Fan Xian paused for a moment and slowly closed his eyes. Facing the Danzhou Sea breeze, he quietly said, "In reality, the reason is very simple. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Just like what I often said when I was young, only when drunk will I know the strength of life. Only after death will I know the weight of life. A person who has never died will never know how terrifying death is. I want to live on in this world, so I have to be ruthless. I have to make myself strong. And you don't know, when you're used to lying on the bed and can't move a finger even if you want to torture yourself. Suddenly, the heavens give you a chance to torture yourself. You'll be extremely grateful to the heavens, and you'll be intoxicated by it." Fan Xian was intoxicated in the memories of his 2 lives. Wan'er, who was by his side, couldn't understand it all. She looked at his delicate and handsome face with a sense of maturity and vicissitudes that completely did not match his age. Her heart was moved and grieved. She felt that her heart followed Fan Xian's heart and surged with an indescribable sorrow. Wan'er's eyes were slightly wet. With some difficulty, she stood on her tiptoes and gripped the corner of her sleeve to help Fan Xian wipe the corner of his eyes. The trip back to Danzhou to visit relatives ended like this. However, before he left, Fan Xian gathered in the old lady's study and muttered to her for a long time about the news from Jingdou. These two, who appeared to be the most gentle but were actually the coldest, carried out a serious conversation. When he left the study, Fan Xian's expression was slightly heavy. Returning to the room, Wan'er carefully asked, "What happened?" "Nothing big." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then calmly said, "It is natural for the imperial censors to send a letter. I am an imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road. Running to Danzhou to play is certainly an eyesore to many people. More importantly, I heard some news that is not very comfortable." "What news?" One saw a rare glimmer of annoyance appear on her husband's face and couldn't resist smiling. To be able to make you lose your composure. Fan Xian sighed and forced a smile. During the new year, Yan Xiaoyi will also be returning to the capital to report on his work. He will probably be entering the capital at about the same time as me. Yan Xiaoyi? The Qin Kingdom's northern governor, the former commander of the imperial army, and a famous 9th-level super ace in the Qin Kingdom. Most importantly, he was the eldest princess' trusted aide and had a reputation in the military. Even the emperor would not rashly suppress him without evidence. When such a figure returned to the capital, it was inevitable that he would directly come into contact with Fan Xian. Fan Xian still remembered the shocking arrow he had encountered when he had snuck into the royal palace. Wan'er furrowed her brows and said, "Is the martial conference in front of the palace going to resume?" Fan Xian glanced at her in shock. Shortly after, he smiled and patted her head. He thought to himself that his wife's sense of smell was indeed sharp in this area. Nodding his head, he said, "I heard it is the Bureau of Military Affairs' intention. The military has suggested resuming the martial conference to raise the morale of the people." "What did the emperor say?" Wan'er asked worriedly. She knew that the Qin Kingdom was a country that conquered the world on horseback and had always placed great importance on military achievements. However, after 3 northern expeditions, the emperor had recuperated in preparation for another battle. He had turned his gaze to governance and stopped the most important annual martial conference many years ago. "Naturally, the emperor will not object," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "This is a good thing. The court has been in peace for too long. Even the Jiaozhou Navy has changed. Naturally, they need a reason to rally the military's morale." Lin Wan'er was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "I'm afraid it is targeted at you." "I am a civil official," Fan Xian said with a smile, but he clearly felt a problem in his heart. His view was different from that of the second prince on Lujing River. The second prince always thought that the emperor had Fan Xian handle the Jiaozhou Navy matter because he had loosened his mouth to let Fan Xian come into contact with and familiarize himself with military affairs. However, Fan Xian thought that his unyielding father was thinking the opposite problem. He had killed Chang Kuan and secretly harmed Deng Xiaobo. Regardless of the faction in the military, the commanders and generals probably all held a grudge against him. The emperor still did not want the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to gently touch military power. Wan'er looked at him and sighed. "You are a civil official, but you are also a martial ace known to all under heaven." Fan Xian's eyebrows rose. "You mean that Yan Xiaoyi will challenge me in the martial conference when he returns to the capital?" The people of the Qin Kingdom loved martial arts. Although this trend had gradually faded, the valiant taste deeply rooted in the hearts of the people and officials could not be brushed away. Just like how Yi Ling could throw a knife outside the royal palace to challenge Fan Xian, duels were still legal matters in the Qin Kingdom. Furthermore, no one was willing to back out of a martial conference in front of the palace. However, Fan Xian was willing to back out. He smiled coldly and said, "How childish. He wants to fight me so I have to fight him?" In his heart, martial arts were used to kill people and not to fight in duels. If he wanted to kill people, Fan Xian had countless methods that were more efficient and safer than a duel. Duel? A child's game. Fan Xian suddenly felt that the Qin Kingdom's military was somewhat childish. He couldn't help but snort disdainfully. Wan'er sighed and gently said, "Although this method is direct and effective, it is very stupid. Mother shouldn't be so stupid as to have Yan Xiaoyi challenge you in the palace. Regardless of whether he wins or loses, Yan Xiaoyi wouldn't dare to actually hurt you. The emperor's eyes are watching. Thus, I also feel that I cannot understand the reasoning behind this. Perhaps we are thinking the wrong way. Yan Xiaoyi is the governor of the north. He hasn't returned to the capital in 2 years, so he should be reporting on his work." Fan Xian suddenly had a thought. He furrowed his brows. If Yan Xiaoyi's return to the capital this time had something to do with the so-called martial conference, then it could only mean one thing. The power in the court was finally trying to directly challenge the authority of the royal family. But what right did the eldest princess have? "If I avoid the battle, it will weaken the momentum," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "But, I don't care about this face." This was a lie. Fan Xian was also a vain person. If it was another important military general challenging Fan Xian in the martial conference, Fan Xian wouldn't even blink. He would directly beat the other person until even their mother wouldn't recognize them and add a golden border to his reputation. But that person was Yan Xiaoyi. Fan Xian asked himself honestly. Even though his injuries had long healed and he had the help of Haitang's heart of Tianyi Dao, and he had long stood firmly at the peak of the 9th level. If he were to truly face a super warrior who could shock the world with one arrow, he still wouldn't have it easy. On his side, there were two people who could stand against Yan Xiaoyi Haitang in the shadow. The problem was, these two could not act for him. On his side, there was still one person who could easily finish off Yan Xiaoyi and Uncle Wuzhu. The problem was, Uncle Wuzhu had once again left home. Amidst Fan Xian's nervousness, he suddenly and inexplicably became excited. The tip of his nose seemed to smell the salty and wet smell of the sea cliff. If after returning to the capital, he truly had to fight Yan Xiaoyi head-on. If he didn't rely on those little tricks, just how far could he go? Jingdo, wind and thunder, warriors, martial arts. These words tempted Fan Xian's restless heart. He was silent for a moment. Suddenly he raised his head and smiled. Gently he said, "I won't fight, but how about trying to kill him?" Wan'er opened her eyes wide and was speechless for a moment. "I am about to leave Danzhou. I know some friends feel that this section is a bit long, but before I entered Danzhou, I said in advance that this is a section that I think is very important. I will write it in great detail. Fan Xian's return to Danzhou is the content I passionately hoped for when I wrote the first volume. After looking forward to it for almost a year, I have finally come back. How can I not miss it? How can I not put my heart into it? If I don't write about Dong, I will slap myself ha. Also, when writing a novel online, it is actually very difficult to write about the main character's personality, 3 views, and the like in large chunks. It can only be reflected through small details in different chapters. This is a very complicated matter, so I need the Danzhou section. These chapters are to help this novel stand out and also to satisfy my own interests and aesthetic inclinations. Although they may not be very powerful, I still have to write. No? Writing is so tiring. If I wanted to twist the plot, I would certainly write much faster and I would also earn more money. It is only a problem of rhythm. I'm still learning. The rhythm of a popular novel fluctuates. This is a very difficult problem. There is no trick to it. I can only master it. The more I write, the better I get. I hope that in my future writing career I can reach a certain level. I hope everyone can see me continue to improve. Finally, I very sincerely ask everyone to vote for me. This is the middle of the month and I really need everyone's monthly votes. Those who love Dong, please give me a monthly vote. Those who love Wan, please give me a monthly vote. Those who love Dong, please give me a monthly vote. Those who love Yan Xiaoyi, also have to give me a monthly vote. Writing a book needs to be very sincere, and canvassing for votes also needs to be very sincere. Just like yesterday, a reader in the book review remembered a joke from many months ago. Diarrhea. But don't forget to canvass for votes. I have said so much very seriously. Everyone is not allowed to laugh. Just give me a monthly vote. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 439. On a winter day in the 6th year of the Qing calendar, the gloomy dusk sun shone through from the distant Song Mountains. The weather was very cold. The private residences in the wilderness were all white with snow. The clouds gradually thickened and swallowed the gloomy sun into darkness. The wind also gradually grew stronger, picking up the accumulated snow on the ground and sending it dancing in the air. More snow fell from the sky. Snowflakes of different colors from different places used the power of the wind to tangle together. In the oppressive air, they twisted and turned their heads, displaying different levels of whiteness and coldness. The wind and snow rose again. The people hurrying on the road were unspeakably miserable. They all searched for the nearest cottage or inn to rest. This year there had been no floods in the Qing kingdom, but the snowfall was not small. Fortunately, during the summer, the disaster relief in the Jiangnan counties had gone unusually smoothly. The affected people had a place to stay, so the chances of them freezing to death were much lower. This was Yingzhou, the province that had suffered the most from the floods. It was also the place where the bandits were the most ferocious after the disaster. However, ever since the imperial envoy Fan Xian had come to Jiangnan, the bandits in Yingzhou had become much more well-behaved, perhaps because they were afraid of the might of heaven or the legendary methods of Sir Fan Jr. They had already disappeared for a long time. It was because of this that there were travelers who dared to walk on the road in this snowy day. However, now that the man-made disaster had passed, the heavens did not give them any face. Although the Yangtze River had not been sealed, not many people were willing to brave the harsh cold and walk in the direction of Jingdo. Other than the group of carriages that were all black. The windows and lower edges of the carriages were sealed very well. Not a sliver of cold air could penetrate. However, the thick cotton curtains in front of the carriage blocked the attack of the wind and snow. Occasionally they gave out a few muffled cries of sorrow. There was a heater in the carriage. A gust of hot air followed the fragrance and rose into the air, making the carriage as warm as spring. It formed a clear contrast with the harsh cold outside. Fan Xian felt a little hot. He put 2 fingers on his right hand to his neck and loosened the buttons on his fur coat, exposing his neck. He took 2 deep breaths and put down the file in his hands. He squinted and looked out of the carriage. Outside the carriage was a vast expanse of whiteness. The houses of Tsangshan village, the winter fields and ponds were all covered in snow, frozen into ice mirrors. The scene of the flood that they saw when they passed by this place in the past was no longer visible. The people who died in the flood had long been buried. Perhaps their white bones were still trembling in the depths of the snow. In the distance was a row of simple and crude houses. It could be seen that the materials used to build them were not very sturdy and could not keep out the cold. Looking at the spots of firelight and warmth seeping out from inside, Fan Xian nodded his head with satisfaction. As long as there was firewood for the stove, it was fine. Although the commoners lived hard lives, they could endure it. A little warmth could protect them through this harsh winter. Let's find a place to rest. Fan Xian looked at the snow-covered Overwatch Council carriage driver outside the carriage and couldn't resist furrowing his brows. Although it is important to hurry, don't get sick from the cold. Yes, sir. The group of carriages slowly made a turn and drove along the widest ridge toward the neighboring village. Fan Xian was returning to Jingdo to report on his work. The court had set the date of his return there. Who knew that they would run into the heaviest snowfall in years and be delayed in Shazhou for a few days? Time suddenly became tight. Thus, the subordinates of the Overwatch Council followed his wishes and changed carriages in Shazhou to travel along the road against the wind and snow. When they entered the village, a local Li Zheng had already rushed over to welcome them. This Li Zheng had his hands in a thick cotton-padded jacket, curiously and fearfully looking at the black motorcade. He was wondering which important person would travel in this windy and snowy weather. Naturally, there were Overwatch Council officials who went to negotiate with him. Fan Xian didn't want to disturb the place too much, so he traveled stealthily the entire way. He got off the carriage and felt the snowflakes follow the cold wind into his collar. Unconsciously, he tightened his buckles and walked toward the village with the silver-white fox fur cloak. Hong Chongqing led a few swordsmen of the 6th Bureau and followed silently behind him. Fan Xian glanced out of the corner of his eye and thought of Wen'er, who was still busy in Jiangnan. The 3rd prince had already returned to the capital a month earlier. In order to ensure his wife's safety, he had left Gouda and the other 7 tiger guards in Hangzhou. When they left Danzhou, it was early autumn. Fan Xian and his group first returned to Hangzhou. These few months were mainly used to clean out the remnants of the Juanshan conference in Jiangnan, as well as other matters. The matter they had agreed on in Danzhou had been approved by the palace. Wen'er had taken the lead. The matter had developed unexpectedly smoothly. The Xiong family of Lingnan and the Sun family of Chuanzhou had both invested a large sum of silver into the conference. Even the Ming family, which was like a declining mountain, had shown some interest. However, Wen'er still hadn't thought of a name for this organization or its true use, so she had first taken the name of the Hangzhou Conference and made do with it. With the support of silver and Fan Xian's connections, the Hangzhou Conference could easily purchase northern cheese grain ahead of time. It could easily connect with the various provinces without worrying about the government finding trouble. Additionally, with the connections of the Fan, Lu and Lin families all over the world, as well as Xia Qifei's Jiangnan water bandits channeled deep into the people, the Hangzhou Conference developed quickly. The entire Jiangnan disaster relief work, other than the quartz channel, had another smooth and speedy channel. However, Fan Xian and Wen'er had always been hidden behind the scenes. Not many people knew the role this couple played in the Hangzhou Conference. They all thought that this matter was led by nobles in the palace in Jingdo and the palace treasury transport company Yamen was a tool. There was another heavy snowfall in Jiangnan this winter. Who knew how many families would run out of food, how many farmhouses would be crushed, and how many people would freeze to death? Lin Wen'er had to stay in Hangzhou for a while. At least, she had to help the Jiangnan people get through this period of time before anything else. It was still the same old saying. Even if she couldn't help much, it was better than nothing. Lin Wen'er busied herself in this matter. Her talent for strategy, which had long been helplessly suppressed, finally revealed a corner. Fan Xian did not put too much effort into this matter. It was just his wife alone using letters to control all aspects. Whether coldly, majestically, or gently, she controlled this strange beast. She carefully had it plow the fields for the people under heaven, yet she did not make the government, the driver, feel unhappy. However, this matter was somewhat arduous. The degree of propriety and triviality made even Fan Xian fear it like a tiger. Had finally found something that could prove herself. How could she let it go so easily? Thus she worked tirelessly. When Fan Xian left Hangzhou, he was worried that she would not be able to take good care of herself. The wife of the Ting family was also a servant who deeply feared the mistress, so he decided to leave Cici there. As Fan Xian thought about this, he quickly walked into the village. The carriage had already been set up. He left behind people to guard the place. All of his subordinates, a total of 30 or so people, followed him into the village and entered the almost empty family school. Li Jing carefully followed behind. He did not dare ask who this important figure wearing the expensive fox fur coat was. He could only guess endlessly in his heart. After entering the empty family school, someone had already started a stove. After the ginger and sugar water was cooked, the women in the village hurriedly poured it into bowls and respectfully presented it to the officials. Fan Xian picked it up and took a sip. He didn't say anything. His clear and spirited eyes only stared in a daze at the row of houses outside the main door. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, "If the snow gets heavier, will these houses be able to hold up?" This village was still in Yingzhou. It was also a pitiful place that had been hit by a flood last year. This row of houses had been gradually built last year. They looked thin, so Fan Xian was a bit worried. Li Jing paused. He wasn't sure if this person was asking him. Hong Changqing coughed and gave him a meaningful glance. Only now did Li Jing wake up. His half-bent body moved a few steps closer to Fan Xian and respectfully replied, "Master, in a few days the snow will be even thicker. Whether or not it will be able to hold up, I'm really not sure." Fan Xian glanced at him with some surprise. He thought it was rare for a mere Li Jing to not keep on boasting. He smiled warmly and said, "Then won't you have to patrol every day?" Li Jing chuckled and said, "Master, what are you talking about? With such heavy snow as Li Jing, of course I have to look at it every day." He then proudly said, "However, I think it shouldn't be a problem. Don't look at these houses as unremarkable. They were designed by the master craftsmen of the palace treasury. I heard that the 3 large workshops all live in these kinds of houses. The snow should be fine." Fan Xian began to laugh. His subordinates behind him also began to laugh. Li Jing was a bit confused. He thought, what is so funny? He asked a few more questions about whether there was enough firewood and briquettes. Fan Xian then ended his conversation with Li Jing. Involuntarily, a complicated emotion welled up in his heart. The power of the Qing kingdom was indeed powerful. As long as it was operated properly, it would not be a problem to ensure these commoners a normal life. As for himself, he seemed to be gradually getting used to the feeling of being a powerful official. Although he was just passing by, he couldn't resist asking a few more questions. Powerful official? Fan Xian sighed and walked to the door of the school. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the darkening sky outside, the colder wind, the heavier and heavier snow, and the deeper and deeper cold. His thoughts floated to another place. The first time he thought he should be a powerful official in this life was when he said it to his father. The second time was when he was drunk in Shangjing in northern Qi. Haitang left. When Lang Qiao brought the northern Qi diplomatic group to Suzhou, Fan Xian knew that Haitang would certainly follow her brother disciple back to northern Qi. For one, it was the northern Qi Empress Dowager's edict. For another, Haitang couldn't find any excuse to convince herself to stay. She was the saint girl of northern Qi, not the Qing kingdom's princess. What right did she have to live in the Fan family's Hua garden every day? Furthermore, her most important mission in coming south was to help the northern Qi emperor monitor Fan Xian's performance of the secret agreement. Given her relationship with Fan Xian, it seemed that even the northern Qi emperor had a headache. Naturally, he would follow the Empress Dowager's wishes and summon this disciple aunt back. Fan Xian did not see that scene with his own eyes, but it was as if he could always see it in his mind. That flowery dress, that village girl, swaying her body, carrying a basket and leaving Suzhou at ease. She didn't even turn her head to look. Although Haitang had left, Fan Xian's agreement with northern Qi continued to progress steadily. The smuggling along the North Road had already entered a stable stage under Fan Xizha and Xia Qifei's North and South cooperation. The channels between the two sides had already been opened. Goods produced by the palace treasury flowed endlessly into northern Qi territory. The price was much cheaper than on the market. The Qing court had lost a great deal of silver because of Fan Xian's secret mischief, but the Hangzhou conference had gained a great deal of silver. It was all the people's silver. Who cared who was holding it and who was using it? Under Fan Xian's attack, the Ming family had truly sunk into a stalemate. Although the Ming family still had tens of millions of liang of silver in their hands, assets were not flowing water. The Ming family could not bear to sell off their land and property to make their business more active. Thus, they could only borrow money from outside to move things around. The problem was that the old Ming matriarch had been strangled to death by Ming Qingda. This master of the Ming family did not have time to completely accept the old matriarch's position in the Juanshan conference. Although Dongyi's Taiping money house still supported the Ming family, it was clearly much weaker. Thus, Ming Qingda could only go to find the person who had lent him a helping hand during his time of great trouble. Zhaoshang money house. Fan Xian stood at the door with his head lowered. The more he borrowed, the better. He had to follow the emperor's wishes and take everything the Ming family had without bloodshed. That was why he had dragged things out for so long. He raised his head and looked at the heavy snow in front of him. His heart was filled with satisfaction and pride. He had been proud of himself for so many years, but to be able to settle Jiangnan, he had to allow himself a chance to be proud. Suddenly, his pupils constricted abruptly. In the heavy snow, a black line broke through the wind. Like a streak of black lightning, it seemed to have already crossed the distance between time and space. Using the wind and snow to cover the sound of breaking through the air, it came in front of him in an instant. It was an arrow, a black arrow. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and did not dodge or avoid it. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body suddenly rose. His left hand moved and the long sword at his waist swung up. The tip of the sword chopped straight forward. There was a muffled thud. Fan Xian's seemingly simple but actually ruthless strike struck empty air. A green banner suddenly appeared in front of him. Under the banner was a green-clothed man with a green cloth band tied to his hair. The soul-eating arrow landed on the pole in the middle of the banner. The feathers of the arrow trembled endlessly. He saw two large words written on the banner. Tai Xiong. The secret agents of the Overwatch Council had long reacted. 6 swordsmen held hard crossbows and surrounded the green-clothed man in the center. The other 6 bureau swordsmen had already followed the snowflakes in the dark night toward where the arrow had come from and disappeared into the darkness. Fan Xian looked at the green-clothed man. His gaze was calm. No one knew what he was thinking. Suddenly he opened his mouth and said, "Return." With one simple word, all of the 6 bureau swordsmen who had snuck out to chase after the archer obeyed the order and stood silently on the snowy plain in front of the school, surrounding the green-clothed man in the center. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at the green banner. Suddenly he said, "Fortune teller, did you calculate that someone was coming to assassinate me?" The green-clothed man lowered his head. His face could not be seen clearly. He only smiled slightly and said, "How could a mere little arrow hurt Sir Fan Jr.?" Fan Xian calmly said, "That is why I do not understand. The big arrow did not move, so how did the little arrow come?" The green-clothed man warmly said, "The little arrow is young and has a fiery temper. He is always a bit impulsive." Fan Xian was silent. The green-clothed man continued, "I am also not a fortune teller." He put 2 fingers together and pointed at the 2 words on the banner in his hand. "My surname is Tai and my name is Xiang. Yesterday's canvassing for votes was very effective, very good. Continue canvassing for monthly votes. Vote for me, vote for me. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 440. Tai Xiong. Fan Xian's eyes glanced at the green banner and narrowed his eyes slightly. With a wave of his sleeves, he walked back into the school, coldly leaving the green-clothed man outside the room. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council glanced warily at the green-clothed man and also retreated into the room. Although they didn't know why the commissioner had stopped them from chasing after the archer, the council's orders were like a mountain. No one dared to raise any objections. The green-clothed man tilted his head slightly and held the green banner in his hand. He seemed to be startled. Heavy snow swirled and fell in the darkness, gradually accumulating on his shoulders. This scene was indeed a bit strange. After the sudden assassination, Fan Xian was as quiet as if nothing had happened. He paid no attention to the green-clothed man who had suddenly appeared in front of him and helped him block that frightening arrow. It was as if he had no interest in talking at all. The green-clothed man looked at the tightly shut door and couldn't resist shaking his head and smiling. He thought to himself that the legendary Sir Fan Jr. was indeed an interesting person. He tidied his clothes again and calmly walked to the wooden door of the school. He stretched out his hand and politely and gently knocked twice. A moment later, Fan Xian's calm voice came from inside the door. "Please come in." The green-clothed man placed the green banner beside the wooden door of the school. The snow on the banner soaked the gray ground. He lowered his head. One could see the glimmer of a smile at the corner of his lips. He did not directly bow to Fan Xian. On the contrary, he laughed lightly and said, "Compared to the rumors, you have a sliver of arrogance." Fan Xian's hands were placed in front of him by the fire. He still did not open his mouth. The green-clothed man warmly said, "Is this how you treat a guest?" Fan Xian rubbed his warm hands together and accepted a bag of fine wine from the hands of a subordinate beside him. He drank a few mouthfuls and lightly said, "The weather is cold and the ground is frozen. You knocked, so I let you in to avoid the snow. This is me taking pity on my people, not treating you as a guest." "If I didn't knock, you wouldn't see me?" The green-clothed man continued to ask. "Does you not have anything to ask me?" Fan Xian glanced at him coldly. He didn't clearly see the green-clothed man's face and said, What right do you have for me to see you? What do I need to ask you?" The green-clothed man slowly raised his head, and the great hall of the family school that was illuminated by the light of the fire suddenly became bright. This person's eyebrows were like swords, his eyes were as warm as jade, and his lips were thin and slightly curled up, losing a trace of sharpness and adding a touch of friendliness. His appearance was unusually delicate and handsome, but his age was unusually young. Even Fan Xian couldn't help but be a little absent-minded. He smiled and thought to himself, "This guy is quite good-looking, only a little worse than me." The green-clothed man seemed to have not expected such a cold attitude from Fan Xian. He smiled bitterly and said, "Why must you keep me at a distance?" Fan Xian drank another mouthful of wine and withdrew his gaze from the person's gentle and beautiful face. Lightly he said, "Have you done me a service?" The blue-clothed man thought for a moment, then said, "Even if I were not here tonight, that arrow would not have been able to harm you in the slightest." This was what he had said before. Fan Xian placed the wine bag at his side and looked at him calmly. "Since you are of no help to me, then don't expect me to remember your kindness. You should understand this." The green-clothed man paused and smiled. "Precisely." Fan Xian continued, "I don't owe you anything. If you want to avoid the snow, then avoid it. If you want to talk, then say it. But don't act so mysterious and unfathomable. I loathe that." The green-clothed man smiled bitterly and said, "You are right. Also." Fan Xian suddenly moved forward and said seriously, "Are you prepared for me to take you?" From ancient times to now, from history to stories, this kind of meeting in the wilderness, where the famous and powerful officials followed the wheel of history, was always accompanied by a melodramatic show of idealism, respect for the wise, loyalty, and surrender. However, it had probably never been as direct and shrewd as Fan Xian described it. It was even unsightly and unsightly. It had probably never happened before. Fan Xian stared into the green-clothed man's eyes and said, "Don't have the extravagant hope that we can have an equal relationship. If you want to be my subordinate, then you must stand below me and pay attention to your own limits. Regardless of whether it is talking, doing things, or even posture as well as your inner thoughts, you must all be placed below me." He straightened his body and lightly said, "If you want me to take you, then give up those unrealistic fantasies and pride. In this world, it is not that it won't turn if someone is missing. My personality is a bit strange and I don't have the hobby of taking in guests." The green-clothed man had been dealt a heavy blow by Fan Xian's words. He stood gloomily in the hall and was silent for a long time before he forced a smile and said, "You are indeed overbearing." Fan Xian calmly cut him off. "Because I have the right." Without waiting for the green-clothed man to speak, Fan Xian said, "If you have something you want to say, then say it. Otherwise, go sit in the corner and warm yourself by the fire. Once the snow stops, leave." The green-clothed man had not thought that things would develop to such a state. He couldn't help but shake his head. He had to get close to Fan Xian before he entered Jingdo and convey a certain message to him. Coincidentally, he knew the direction of that little arrow, so he had found this opportunity to appear in front of Fan Xian. He had thought that he would obtain a good first impression of Fan Xian. Unexpectedly, although Fan Xian was not overly suspicious, he had broken through his thoughts with unusual strength. The green-clothed man thought for a moment and then smiled slightly. On the way back to the capital, perhaps I can protect you a little. That's not a good reason. Fan Xian shook his head. You and I both know that it is only a little arrow that has come. I don't think much of it. The green-clothed man thought for a bit and finally sighed. I have brought you a piece of news. What news? News from the east. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head and stared into the green-clothed man's eyes. The green-clothed man accepted it calmly. He was actually one of the top figures among the young people in the world, so he was able to remain calm in the face of Fan Xian's might. Fan Xian clapped his hands. In the middle of the hall, all of the Overwatch Council swordsmen and secret agents stood silently and walked out of the main doors of the school. Hong Changqing turned and carefully closed the wooden door, leaving a quiet place for Fan Xian and the green-clothed man. After the room recovered its silence, the green-clothed man smiled slightly and raised his hands in greeting. Dongyi greets the commissioner. Fan Xian fell silent. He slowly took a few deep breaths to recover his calm. A glimmer of coldness flashed through his eyes. He coldly asked, "Tell me your name." The 13th disciple of the sword hut, Tai Xiang. Sigu Jian only took 12 disciples. Fan Xian looked at the green-clothed man and said. Furthermore, I have never heard of a young man called Tai Xiang in Dongyi. People I have never heard of do not exist. Given the Overwatch Council's intelligence network that covered the world, Fan Xian said these words with great confidence. The green-clothed man lowered his head in silence for a moment. He then smiled slightly and said, My original name is Wang Shi. I came to the Qin Kingdom on my teacher's orders to travel and changed my name to Tai Xiang. Wang Shi. Fan Xian casually said. A good name. The green-clothed man called Wang Shi smiled slightly and said, The name isn't necessarily very good, but this person still has some use. At this moment, Fan Xian should have asked why Dongyi and the Overwatch Council were irreconcilable enemies. Strangely, Fan Xian didn't open his mouth to ask, and Wang Shi didn't open his mouth to explain. These two young people both had intelligence and calculations that far surpassed those of their age. They saw through each other's thoughts in an instant. For Fan Xian, Dongyi should have long sent someone to make contact with him. He had not thought that the person who came would be a young man he couldn't see through. Dongyi had always had a good relationship with Xinyang. Presumably, Sigu Jian was like Yi Luyun, enjoying the offerings of the Juanshan conference. However, Fan Xian knew that there were no eternal enemies or eternal friends in this world. There were only eternal benefits. Although Sigu Jian had been an idiot in the past, to be able to single-handedly protect Dongyi and the various small kingdoms for 20 years, he had relied on more than just the sword in his hand. Those who held the country had to be careful. Under the powerful pressure of the Qin kingdom, if Dongyi wanted to survive, they had to maintain close ties with the highest levels of power in the Qin kingdom. The relationship between Sigu Jian and the eldest princess had developed in this way. Following Fan Xian's appearance, the power structure of the Qin kingdom had changed greatly, particularly after he took control of the Overwatch Council and Palace Treasury. Fan Xian already had the power to threaten Dongyi. In comparison, the eldest princess had fewer and fewer chips in her hands. It was impossible to put all the eggs in one basket. The chips could not always be placed on the big side. It was impossible for the girls in the family to all marry into one family. This was a problem of sharing the risks. Sigu Jian was still holding the eldest princess captive. The closeness of the relationship between Dongyi and Xinyang was something Fan Xian could not compare to. Furthermore, ever since Fan Xian had made his debut, he had formed a grudge with Dongyi that was difficult to resolve. For example, the two female assassins on Yolan Street and the sudden attack on Yunjilan by West Lake. However, Dongyi still had to come into contact with Fan Xian. If the eldest princess fell, Fan Xian would, without question, become Dongyi's first choice. Before making this choice, Dongyi had to first express its goodwill. Politics was indeed wonderful. Fan Xian and Dongyi were clearly still enemies, but both sides knew that while they were enemies, they had to begin trying to come into contact. Today they would still fight to the death. In the future, perhaps they would drink and chat merrily. In the face of great profit, any kind of grudge could be washed away. Although Fan Xian would not think this way, Sigu Jian would certainly think this way. However, Fan Xian also knew that Dongyi and him could only have this kind of secret exchange. Sigu Jian, that idiot, still had most of his chips on the eldest princess side. Just as Prime Minister Lin had analyzed in Wuzhou, if that thing really happened, Dongyi could guarantee decades of peace. Why would they still need to come find him? The reason this white-clothed man called Wang Shi had come into contact with him was just to open the way. Is this your teacher's idea or Dongyi's? Fan Xian asked. Wang Shi thought for a moment and then replied with a slight smile, "It is my teacher's idea." Between the question and answer, both sides knew that this kind of contact could not be brought out into the open. This was just Sigu Jian's shrewd and ruthless hidden move. This move could not be known by anyone. "What's in it for me?" Fan Xian asked straightforwardly. "A large group of 9th-level aces from the Sword Hut all want to assassinate me in Jiangnan. I can't pretend nothing has happened just because of one word from you." "There are no benefits, only an attitude," Wang Shi explained warmly. "Dongi and you are still enemies, but I am not. I am the attitude teacher has expressed. Not many people in Dongi know of my existence. As long as you are willing, I will stand by your side. This will never change. Even if your eldest disciple brother wants to assassinate me again?" Fan Xian picked up the metal rod and pushed at the burning charcoal in the basin. Casually he said, "Will you also stand by my side and kill all of your Dongi people?" "Yes," Wang Shi replied seriously. "Anyone who is unfavorable to you is my enemy." Fan Xian couldn't resist laughing. He let out a long sigh and said, "Sigu Jian, oh Sigu Jian, the things this idiot thinks of are indeed interesting." As he said this, Fan Xian watched Wang Shi's reaction from the corner of his eye. When he said the word, idiot, the biggest taboo in Dongi, the other party's expression remained calm and unmoved. The 13 disciples of the Sword Hut. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. There were 4 great grandmasters in the world, plus Uncle Wuzhu. Ku He's true last disciple was Haitang, so Uncle Wuzhu's last disciple was him. If the green-clothed man in front of him was truly Sigu Jian's last disciple, then he should also be a powerful figure. "In the future, I will call you 13th Wang," Fan Xian said calmly. Fan Xian calmly said, "13th Wang, have you ever thought, given my vengeful personality, that Dongi will still follow that crazy woman to deal with me in the future? How could I let Dongi go just because of you? Working together is beneficial for both sides." Wang Shi smiled freely with an indescribable ease. "As for those who have offended you, you can think of a way to kill them. Teacher had me enter the Qing kingdom to travel. I have no hidden evil intentions, so I have to survive. As long as I survive," Wang Shi said calmly, "Dongi will continue to live as it is now." Hearing these calm but actually unusual words, Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and said, "Are you also going to the capital?" "Yes." Wang Shi sighed leisurely. "Since I am traveling, of course I have to go to the Qing kingdom's Jingdo. I heard that there is a Baoyue brothel in the Jingdo. There are countless beauties in the brothel. I must savor it well." Fan Xian didn't even raise his head. "I won't give you a discount." Wang Shi smiled and said, "I can also earn a lot of silver from fortune-telling." "Didn't you say earlier that you weren't a fortune-teller?" Fan Xian asked. Wang Shi replied in a quiet voice, "Sir, fate is too strange. It moves through the wind and clouds, and the stars flicker endlessly. It is not something a mortal can calculate." Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. A moment later he slowly said, "Going back to the original topic, that is the same as saying that you are Sigu Jian's attitude alone, a minute part of his attitude, and that it has nothing to do with Dongi's edict?" "You could say it like that," Wang Shi replied, neither servile nor overbearing. "Very good." Fan Xian rubbed his hands, which had begun to grow cold again, and placed them above the brazier. His eyes looked at the bright red seeping through the white ash in the brazier and said, "I don't like having a very powerful archer spying in the dark all the way back to the capital and suddenly shooting a few arrows out of the blue." Wang Shi was silent. "Go break that little arrow outside." Fan Xian raised his head to look at him. "Since you are Sigu Jian's attitude, I want to see your attitude. Before I enter the capital, I want to see the head of that little arrow." Wang Shi continued to be silent. After a long time he gently nodded his head. He picked up the long green banner from the side of the door. Just as he was about to push the wooden door open, he suddenly turned around and said, "I don't really like killing people. Can we change the content?" Fan Xian's head had already lowered again. Coldly he said, "If you don't know how to kill, what use is there for me to keep you? My skills are not bad." Wang Shi said calmly, but there was an unfathomable feeling in his words. "I can protect you." "Protect me?" The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched and he smiled. "I don't think you have the right to say that." Wang Shi smiled and said, "I am qualified. Sir, you can try." Given Fan Xian's present realm, for Wang Shi to say such a thing showed that he had a strong confidence in his abilities. But Fan Xian still did not raise his head. He only said quietly, "Don't talk big in front of me. The Qing kingdom is not Dongi. You can die at any time in the wilderness, and you don't know from which part of the sky the rope that takes your life comes. As soon as he finished speaking, the light in the family school suddenly dimmed. A gust of wind blew, blowing the ash that was like snow in the brazier. A strong, secretive and murderous aura enveloped Wang Shi, who was at the door. Wang Shi's hand holding the green banner shook slightly. The black arrow stuck in the pole of the green banner shattered into pieces. Wang Shi coughed gently and took a few steps back. There was not a trace of fear on his face. On the contrary, he smiled and said, "No wonder my eldest disciple brother would return in defeat in Jiangnan. With such an ace protecting you at your side, naturally you don't need me. That's fine, then I'll help you kill a few people." After saying this, he pushed open the door and disappeared into the night. That long green banner flickered in and out of sight in the night snow. I read all the book reviews seriously. I'm just a bit lazy, so I haven't replied these 2 days. Sorry. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 441. The snow continued to fall, and the night gradually deepened. The official in the village was arranging for this group of officials to go to various private residences to rest. Fan Xian did not have Hong Changqing and the swordsman on night duty because he knew there were still dangers hidden outside. Although the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau were skilled in assassination, they did not have good methods for long-distance attacks. He was the only one left in a daze in the spacious school. Although the fire in the brazier was burning and there was a lot of bamboo charcoal by the side of the brazier, it made one feel as if the temperature had dropped slightly. It was completely silent. Fan Xian stretched out his hands to warm himself by the fire. His head was slightly tilted. It was clear he was in a daze. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "I struck out with that sword." He paused and then concluded, "But it struck empty air." The light in the great hall of the school changed slightly. The red light from the brazier shone on Fan Xian's shadow. The shadow twisted and moved on the ground. Then, a black-clothed person walked out of the shadows and naturally sat down beside Fan Xian. Fan Xian glanced at the pale-faced middle-aged man and handed over the wineskin. The shadow looked calmly at Fan Xian's wrist and the wineskin in his hand. He thought for a moment and then shook his head. In a dark voice he said, "Wine will slow a person's reaction. What is the name of Yan Xiaoyi's son?" Fan Xian changed the topic and took back the wineskin to take a sip. He felt a spicy line of fire burn from his lips to his organs. "I don't know." The shadow shook his head and then said, "The nickname you gave him is not bad." Fan Xian said, "Don't be too nervous. This little archer should still be freezing in the snowy night outside. How would he dare to come close to attack?" The shadow nodded. Fan Xian once again handed over the wineskin and said, "Take a few sips. I'm not Qin Pingping. Although there are many people in this world who want to kill me, at least it is not so easy." The shadow thought for a moment and accepted the wineskin. He took a few shallow sips. A moment later, 2 lines of red seeped out of his pale cheeks. He looked like a clown on a stage and was very cute. Fan Xian chuckled and said, "If we were in each other's shoes, I wouldn't be able to endure the loneliness in the darkness. I've always been curious. Don't you usually need to eat or drink?" When protecting Qin Pingping or Fan Xian, the shadow never left their side. No wonder Fan Xian had asked this. The shadow said gloomily, "Of course I have my ways." Fan Xian shook his head and didn't say anything more. Turning the subject back to his earlier words, he said, "You saw my sword strike empty air." "Yes, sir." There was no emotion in the shadow's voice. 13th Wang is very powerful. Fan Xian was silent. Of course he knew that Wang Shi was very powerful. Powerful enough that he could approach the school silently in the snowy night without him or the shadow noticing. Powerful enough that he could block in front of Fan Xian like a wandering spirit when the arrow was in the air, making it so that Fan Xian's sword struck empty air. It looked like a simple green banner blocking, but Fan Xian knew the power contained in the black arrow in the snowy night. The more casual Wang Shi appeared, the more it proved his power. "I can't see through him." Fan Xian picked up the metal rod from beside his feet and carelessly scratched it in the fire basin. This 13th Wang is indeed very powerful, but he can endure. Those who can endure must have a great plan. He suddenly raised his brows. "It's not enduring. He doesn't care." Wang Shi's way of talking shows that he doesn't care about many things. He doesn't care about my verbal attacks or my purposeful humiliation. If he was truly sent by Sigu Jian, why doesn't he care? Only by not caring can one not care. If a person can't see what they want, then it will be troublesome. What exactly did 13th Wang want? This question gradually weighed on Fan Xian's heart. He didn't like a situation where an outsider suddenly ran in and messed things up. The shadow suddenly opened his mouth and said, "This person should be a member of the Sword Hut, but not just a member of the Sword Hut." Fan Xian didn't really understand, but he trusted the shadow's judgment. The last disciple Sigu Jian taught was indeed mysterious and powerful. He sighed and said, "Let's wait until he kills the little archer before we talk." The shadow glanced at him and knew that this was the so-called proof of allegiance. He knew that Fan Xian had borrowed this knife to kill not to see the quality of the knife, but to see the heart of the knife. If 13th Wang really was Sigu Jian's attitude and Yin Xiaoyi's son died at his hands, Fan Xian would have a great deal to do. At least, a large crack would appear in the relationship between Xinjiang and Dongyi. Other people don't know that 13th Wang is Sigu Jian's last disciple, the shadow reminded. Fan Xian calmly explained, "If he kills the little archer, I will let everyone in the world know that he is Sigu Jian's last disciple." The shadow was silent for a moment. "Sir is wise. However, this kind of benefit may not be enough." Fan Xian understood what he meant. Playing Sigu Jian into this would make Dongyi angry. Although Fan Xian and the entire Qing court were used to putting the blame on Sigu Jian, that idiot, now that Sigu Jian had given a sliver of his sincerity to Fan Xian, it would be a pity if this sliver of sincerity was used to tear apart the relationship between Xinjiang and Dongyi. He glanced at the shadow and faintly said, "I'll listen to you on the matters of Dongyi. You're more familiar with them than me." "Yes, sir," the shadow slowly said. "Also, in the next 5 days there will be heavy snow. It's perfect for archery attacks. You have to be careful. How far are the Black Knights from us?" Tenli Fan Xian fell silent. In such heavy snow, it was truly troublesome for an archer to follow the carriages from a distance. Fortunately, there were the Black Knights sweeping the surroundings. It was impossible for the other party to mobilize a military group to take the risk. If they wanted to mobilize an army to kill Fan Xian, they would have to kill all of the targets and not leave a trace of evidence to the palace. Even the Qing Kingdom's most valiant army would not have the ability to completely slaughter 500 Black Knights without leaving a few alive. "I don't understand. Why would he choose to attack me on the way back to the capital? The other party should know that the chances of success are not high," Fan Xian said with furrowed brows. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "Although Yin Xiaoyi's son is young, he should not be so arrogant." "Perhaps he has a reason to act," the shadow slowly said. "I'll go kill him." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then slowly shook his head. "I don't know who else he has at his side. The two of us will stay together and have 13th Wang act. Safety first. For creatures like aces, it is difficult to gather a dozen or two. If there are only a few, why should we worry?" The shadow glanced at him strangely and didn't say anything. Fan Xian raised his head to gaze at the dark beams of the school's great hall. He sighed in his heart. He didn't dare use his own people to carry out the most powerful counterattack in this snowy night. During these few years, the biggest gap in his heart was that arrow and bow. Yin Xiaoyi's bow and arrow. Even now, 2 years later, Fan Xian could still clearly feel the aura of death in the corner tower of the royal palace. The viciousness attached to that arrow still made his heart tremble. The arrow outside the school earlier had come too suddenly and without reason. Fan Xian was worried that this was a trap. It was an attempt to lure him or the shadow into the snowy woods to be killed. Yin Xiaoyi had also received an imperial edict to return to the capital this year. The council said he was still on his way and hadn't reached the capital. Who knew where he was on his way? Was he on his way back to the capital? Fan Xian carelessly prodded at the charcoal in the brazier. His thoughts had long floated to the snowy woods outside the village. The fire in the brazier gradually dimmed and extinguished. "Go to sleep early." Fan Xian sighed in the darkness. He rose and patted his bottom. Tightening the collar of his fox fur coat, he pushed open the door to the school. The wind and snow outside poured in and made him narrow his eyes. However, not a single arrow flew over. On the contrary, it made him feel slightly disappointed. The next day, the group of carriages followed the north of Yingzhou and headed toward Jingdou on the official road. Because of last night's incident, the guards of the entire group of carriages became even stricter. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau split off 3 people to disguise themselves as merchants moving through the snow. They hid in the darkness and watched all suspicious people. Fan Xian gave another order. The 500 Black Knights, who had been protecting the front and back of the group of carriages from afar, also closed the distance to the group. The faint sound of hooves could be heard to ensure safety. Along the way there were always people with a Jianghu aura watching the group of carriages in the tea houses, restaurants, inns and relay stations. The secret agents and swordsmen of the Overwatch Council were cautious. After reporting it to Fan Xian, he only nodded gently and didn't have much of a reaction. Just as they were about to leave Yingzhou, a woman with a broken arm waited respectfully by the side of the road. She stopped the group of carriages and asked to see him. Fan Xian saw her. As he drank his tea, he looked with some interest at this woman with a charming appearance. The woman knelt in the carriage with a glimmer of respect and fear. "Subordinate greets you, sir." Fan Xian nodded and waved his hand. "Guan Wumei, stand up and speak." "Yes." This once famous female bandit in Yingzhou, Xia Qifei's cousin, respectfully stood up. She bent her body so that her head didn't hit the roof of the carriage. "What did you find?" Fan Xian asked as he rubbed the space between his brows. Although the Overwatch Council's intelligence network covered the world, if they wanted to investigate people in the marketplace, it was not as good as the Jiangnan Water Bandits, a gang deeply rooted among the people. Regardless of which and received what guest or which carriage sent who, the Jiangnan Water Bandits could find out everything clearly. Guan Wumei reported the situation of the past few days, then said, "We only vaguely found one person with a large bag, but the brothers in the gang were unable to follow him. The day before yesterday he disappeared from Fujiapo. Looking at the direction he went, he should have gone to the capital." Fan Xian was silent for a moment, thinking that it looked like the little archer was indeed valiant and brave enough to come alone to kill him. After saying a few more words, he had Guan Wumei get off the carriage. The group of carriages began to move forward again. Like the shadow's observation of celestial phenomena, snow continued to fall endlessly in the sky for the next few days. The snowflakes were sometimes large and sometimes small, gradually blinding the eyes and confusing the hearts. Finally they arrived safely at Weizhou upstream of the Wei River. This was the last province in the south before entering Jingdou. The city was not large, but it was still very prosperous. However, the return date of the court had long been set. Fan Xian's silver chest was still on the Wei River. Under the protection of the Shazhou Navy, he slowly headed toward Jingdou, but he could not delay any longer. Thus the next day he left Weizhou. However, he had already revealed his identity. At the same time he had moved 100 provincial soldiers toward Weizhou. The Weizhou side was afraid that something would happen to this important figure, so they agreed to all his requests. The large group traveled north for a day, exiting the borders of Weizhou and entering Jingdou. Fan Xian stood on the carriage and turned his head to look back. He saw Jinggu wearing a silver mask watching him from the low hill behind him. He nodded his head. Jinggu mounted his horse and clenched his right fist. The 500 black knights were like a sharp black knife slicing through the silence of the hill. Passing through the hills, they prepared to return to the Black Knight camp 40 li away. This was a strict rule of the Qin court. The Black Knights were the invincible personal army that the emperor had personally given to Chen Pingping. In order to ensure the Overwatch Council's transcendent position and balance, the Black Knights were strictly forbidden from entering Jingdou. If they took a step in, they would be killed without mercy. This was the iron rule of the Black Knights. Fan Xian often thought that he could understand from this iron rule. Although his old emperor was confident to the point of narcissism and could even treat a rebellion as a joke, he probably also understood in the depths of his heart that if the nobility of Qin Kingdom rebelled, the cripple would be the most terrifying. Although the emperor would not believe that the cripple would rebel as an emperor, he had to be on guard. Entering Jingdou, the roads gradually widened. There were fewer mountains and forests and more people. The wind and snow gradually subsided, and the accumulated snow gradually melted. The wet mud wrapped around the hooves of the horses, making it difficult for the entire group of carriages to move forward. However, the hearts of the people of the Overwatch Council had already relaxed. Around Jingdou, no one dared to carry out an assassination in broad daylight. Although Fan Xian was a careful and cautious person, he was not an exception. Ever since the founding of Qin Kingdom, even if ambitious people occasionally appeared in the military, no one dared to make trouble near Jingdou. A small mountain valley appeared in front of him. The white snow pressed down on the precious evergreen forest, making the tree branches creak and turn into dragons of ice. Fan Xian lifted the heavy curtain and looked at the mountain valley. He found that there were no rocks on the mountain. In the distance he could faintly see the massive city walls of Jingdou. It was like a giant beast that made one feel suffocated. Fan Xian let go of a smile. Jingdou, he had finally returned. The little archer's unreasonable arrow had made him nervous for so many days. It looked like he needed to strengthen his cultivation of the heart. Suddenly his earlobe trembled. He heard the sound of a sharp blade stabbing into flesh in the forest in front of him. It was the sound of the shadow acting. Then he heard the sound of a crossbow moving. Fan Xian let out a sharp whistle and stretched out his hand to grab the driver in front of him. All of the carriages in the group of carriages came to a sudden stop with this sharp whistle. From the top of the short mountain, a giant crossbow bolt broke through the air. Carrying with it the sound of wind and thunder, it shot toward the carriage Fan Xian was in. The driver in front of the carriage gave a wild cry and broke free of Fan Xian's hand, blocking in front of Fan Xian. Although Fan Xian's reaction was fast, the crossbow bolt, about the length of a man's arm, still pierced viciously into the driver's abdomen. Blood and internal organs sprayed out, painting the walls of the carriage. The crossbow bolt broke through the body and nailed the driver's body to Fan Xian's side. Fan Xian's expression was dark. He slapped the wall. With a crack, a wooden board quickly fell from behind the curtain of the carriage, sealing the entire carriage. Immediately after, he heard the terrifying and suffocating sound of crossbow bolts ring out in the mountain valley. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 442. Thud, thud, thud. A wave of densely packed sounds rang out from all directions of the carriage. It was the sound of crossbow bolts hitting the walls of the carriage. It was also a soul-stirring music. In that instant, an unknown number of crossbow bolts shot toward the carriage Fan Xian was in. In particular, the bolt from the terrifying crossbow hidden among them carried an incomparable force as it pierced directly into the carriage. With a bang, the black carriage bounced helplessly. The shaft of the carriage had been shattered by the power of the crossbow bolt. It bounced a little among the rubble. It looked like a frog waiting to be slaughtered. However, the carriage did not split into pieces. Fan Xian lowered his body and lay on the floor of the carriage. He forcefully circulated the Jinqi in his body and neutralized the powerful impact. Looking at the large hole under the body of the coachman beside him, he couldn't help feeling shocked. The power of this kind of giant crossbow bolt was too powerful. It had actually shot a hole through the floor of his carriage, revealing the mountain rocks and snow below. Fan Xian knew how sturdy the Overwatch Council's special carriages were. Between the two layers of wooden boards inside and outside was iron wool and a thin but sturdy steel plate. If it were not for this carriage, which combined the combined intelligence of the Palace Treasury's third workshop and the Overwatch Council's third bureau, he would probably have died long ago under this rain of crossbow bolts. He strained his ears to listen to the whistling sound of the crossbow bolts outside. He knew that the enemy's primary target was him. Although he wasn't sure how the ambushing enemy had seen through the Overwatch Council's change of carriages, he knew that now was not the time to think about the cause and effect. His ears could tell that in such a short time, the speed at which the crossbow bolts fired toward the valley by the enemy to kill him had long surpassed the number on the battlefield when the Qing army attacked foreign cities. Using the method of attacking a city to kill him alone. Such a powerful crossbow bolt attack and the other party's meticulous preparation made Fan Xian feel a glimmer of death. It was clear that the enemy in the valley was also surprised that the carriages in the valley were so sturdy that they could withstand the power of the crossbow bolts. The rain of crossbow bolts continued to fly. The valley was filled with wretched cries and the neighing of horses. At the beginning of the attack, Fan Xian's sharp cry had already notified his Overwatch Council subordinates. The swordsmen and secret agents of the 6th Bureau saw the opportunity and quickly hid in the carriages. However, the carriage drivers and provincial soldiers sent from Weizhou were not so lucky. The crossbow bolts viciously pierced into the heads of the provincial soldiers and into the chests and eyes of the horses. They pierced and tore, separating these living flesh from the life attached to them. There was no way to dodge. More than half of the 100 or so provincial soldiers were killed by the first volley of arrows, while the horses neighed miserably and fell into the snow. Fresh blood dyed the black snow in the valley. It was a tragic sight to behold. There were corpses everywhere. Arrows everywhere. Blood everywhere. Death everywhere. The carriages became the Overwatch Council's last fortress. Wretchedly and pitifully persisted in the rain of crossbow bolts. They were like a boat in the ocean that could be swallowed at any moment by a huge wave. In just a moment, countless black crossbow bolts had been shot into the carriages. The crossbow bolts penetrated deep into the walls and into the steel plates, but they did not fall. The carriages in the valley looked like a coffin box that had suddenly grown countless nether moldy hairs. The teeth-numbing sound of crossbow bolts being knocked came from the mountain forest, accompanied by the low sound of heavy breathing. With a whoosh, The terrifying crossbow bolts shot out again. This time they were not only aimed at the carriage Fan Xian was in. 2 more bolts were also aimed at the carriage in front. The crossbow bolts stabbed viciously into the black carriage. With a loud bang, the carriage jumped up again and then miserably flipped to the left. What kind of power was this? Fan Xian hid in the carriage and felt everything around him turn upside down in an instant. A powerful tremor threw him off the bottom of the carriage. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see diagonally above him. A sharp metal crossbow bolt had already pierced through the wall of the carriage. Sinisterly and terrifyingly, it was only half a foot away from his chest. That was close. Fan Xian looked at the crossbow bolt made entirely of metal and the wood shavings and metal shards it carried out. He knew the carriage wouldn't be able to hold out for long. The carriage couldn't be too heavy, so when it was designed, only a thin layer of steel was sandwiched between the 2 layers of wooden planks. After all, the strange people of the Third Bureau would never have thought that the enemy would use the city's defensive crossbows during an ambush. Fan Xian knew he couldn't sit and wait for death. He hurriedly breathed in 2 mouthfuls of slightly sweet air. Taking advantage of the moment the carriage flipped, his entire body had already crawled out through the hole in the bottom of the carriage. It was clear that the assassin in the valley hadn't expected Fan Xian to find a way out that wasn't within his calculations, so his reaction was a moment too slow. It was at this moment that Fan Xian's toes touched the ground. He didn't dare to stop. Forcefully turning his body, he drew a few strange lines on the empty ground in the valley and charged toward the forest on the other side of the valley in a zigzag pattern. Whoosh 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 whoosh. A dozen slender but sharp crossbow bolts shot viciously into the place where Fan Xian had been earlier. They shot into the bottom of the overturned carriage and into the mud and snow at the bottom of the valley. The danger hadn't been resolved yet. Fan Xian let out a sharp whistle and his entire body flew into the air. He slapped a rock on the ground with one hand and narrowly avoided the second wave of crossbow bolts. The rock shattered. He disappeared. The crossbow bolts missed. Fan Xian swept into the forest. With a flip of his hand, he tied the white fox fur he wore on his left leg. He took out a pill and swallowed it. He then took off his black official robes and wore them inside out. With one hand he pulled out a slender black dagger from his boot. With the other hand he gripped the hilt of the sword at his waist. Like a ghost, he disappeared into the forest. Before he disappeared, he once again let out a sharp whistle. However, he didn't turn his head toward the valley and glance at his trusted subordinates who were in imminent danger. A number of Overwatch Council officials had already died. These people had all died in that moment earlier. When Fan Xian's carriage had been knocked over by the crossbow bolts, these subordinates were worried about his safety. Disregarding the order Fan Xian had sent earlier with his whistle, they forcefully opened the carriage doors and used the crossbow bolts they carried with them to shoot into the valley. They tried to buy some time to catch their breath and rush to the side of Fan Xian's carriage. However, the Overwatch Council officials used hand crossbows. It was clear that their range was not as long as the crossbows of the people in the forest. Although the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau had been trained to be like killing gods in the night, faced with such a sudden rain of crossbows, they still had no chance to retaliate. In just an instant, the crossbow bolts had turned the Overwatch Council official who had just opened the carriage door into a porcupine. The official's eyes were not closed. The fastest person was only able to get 6 steps closer to Fan Xian's carriage before he was nailed to the ground by 3 crossbow bolts. Fan Xian saw this scene, but his expression became even calmer. There was a glimmer of pale white coldness in the calmness. Only calmness could he counterattack effectively. Counterattack. When he came out of the carriage he swayed 3 times in a row. However, a crossbow bolt still struck his left thigh. Although it only grazed the skin, it still hurt like fire. The fox fur coat was a bit soft. It tied around the wound on his thigh and was very suitable. Perfect for a counterattack. There were snowy forests on both sides of the valley. The sound that had made Fan Xian's ears twitch earlier was the shadow's warning. He knew that the shadow was in that mountain forest, so he chose the opposite direction. He trusted in the shadow's strength. No matter how many people were in that mountain forest, the shadow could make those crossbowmen die or sink into the shadow of death. Fan Xian had to personally deal with the mountain forest on this side. Such a dense rain of crossbows had to stop. Otherwise, everyone in the valley would die. As long as the rain of crossbows stopped, it would give the Overwatch Council secret agents in the carriage a chance to escape into the mountain forest. Fan Xian believed that the men of the 6th Bureau would certainly use the black swords in their hands to reap the lives of these assassins. Reap them cleanly without leaving a single one. A few hurried whistles rang out from the snowy forest. It was clear that the enemy had already discovered that Fan Xian had escaped into the snowy forest. They were moving people in an attempt to carry out the final attack. No one dared to underestimate a commissioner of the Overwatch Council, a 9th-level ace. Thus, the whistles that were used to convey orders were rather frantic. At this moment, the number of crossbow bolts shooting into the valley had decreased. The people who were shooting at the carriage knew that their target was Fan Xian. If Fan Xian did not die, then all of them would die. Although there were fewer crossbow bolts, they still maintained sufficient density and power to force the Overwatch Council swordsmen to stay in the carriage. The search and killing continued. In the snowy ground near the top of the mountain, the sound of footsteps rang out. A man holding a crossbow watched his surroundings cautiously. The snowy ground suddenly split open. A black dagger pierced deeply into his abdomen. The dagger stirred for a moment before it was pulled out so that the poison would spread faster. The man lowered his head in pain and despair. Looking at the white-clothed young man in front of him, he wanted to call for help, but a streak of black light sliced through his throat. Fresh blood sprayed out. He clutched his throat and knelt on the snowy ground. His right hand dug weakly and the crossbow bolt in his hand shot toward the snowy ground beside his knees. The powerful rebound made his dying body jump. He fell onto the snowy ground with a muffled thud. After Fan Xian slit the man's throat, he flew forward indifferently and hid behind a tree. He looked coldly at the man's last move and felt a chill in his heart. Even at death's door, he didn't forget to inform his comrades of the enemy situation. The Qing army was indeed the most valiant troop in the world. Breaking through the snowy forest and ascending the snowy mountain, Fan Xian had already killed a dozen people. His body also felt a little tired. He knew that there were more than 200 crossbowmen ambushing him this time. Furthermore, there were a number of aces among them. Even he found it difficult to move. It seemed that the shadow had not completely succeeded. The other party had truly paid a great price. At this moment, he had already broken through 2 lines of sniper fire and arrived at a place close to the top of the mountain. This was because he knew that the several powerful city-guarding crossbows were placed here. He was already close to his goal. He didn't care about the warning the man gave before his death. Stealth and assassination were more physically and mentally exhausting than an open battle, so he decided to change his method. The sound of people stepping on the snow rang out in the forest. A group of crossbowmen patrolled the surroundings nervously. Half of the crossbowmen had been sent to kill Fan Xian. A portion was suppressing the carriages in the valley. No one had thought that Fan Xian would be able to break through 2 lines of defense without a sound and come to the top of the mountain. Not many people in this world knew that Fan Xian had learned from a young age to assassinate and to prevent being assassinated. This kind of stealth instinct had already entered his blood. The snow flew again. It was as if a line of snow had suddenly appeared on the ground. A snowy shadow flashed out from behind a tree. Taking advantage of the snowflakes falling from the trees, it transformed into a straight line and charged forward. What a fast speed! These crossbowmen only saw a blur in front of their eyes and felt a wave of coldness. The crossbow bolts in their hands shot out randomly in their nervousness. Thud, thud, thud. Fan Xian swept out amidst the crisscrossing crossbow bolts that hid danger. The black, slender dagger in his left hand slid across the crossbowmen's throats. His right hand flipped and pulled out the long sword on his back, directly chopping forward. His left hand was delicate and gentle, his right was tyrannical. On the left was a black line. On the right was a ball of bright color. Crossbow bolts flew through the air and shot into the sky and into the dense tree trunks of the snowy forest. Under the outline of this black line and the bright ball of color, a group of crossbowmen cried out wretchedly and fell to the ground one by one. Fresh blood flowed chaotically. With a clang, the sword in Fan Xian's right hand met with a powerful resistance in the end. Fan Xian's feet did not touch the ground. He swept back and stood 3 steps in front of that person, looking coldly at him. The other person held a knife with both hands. Although he was slightly afraid, he still stared valiantly into Fan Xian's eyes and shouted loudly to notify his nearby comrades. Fan Xian still did not move. He looked at him coldly and then spat out a word, "Duo?" By the time he finished speaking, his black dagger had already shot out, and his body also followed this black dagger with incredible speed, shooting out as if the black dagger was dragging a shadow behind it. In an instant, Fan Xian had arrived in front of that person. The black dagger had also arrived in front of him. Slightly confused by the word "duo," the person shouted fiercely and chopped down with both knives, sending the black dagger into the snowy ground. Fan Xian let out a strange cry. His body rose up 2 feet. His right wrist flipped and the long sword hung upside down, thrusting toward the person's opening. To be able to survive was already proof of that person's strength. He quickly took 3 steps back. His hands did not let go of the knife hilt. Instead, he swung it in the opposite direction. A flash of knife light flashed and in an instant, blocked the power of Fan Xian's sword. A crisp clang rang out. The knife broke. The person's chest tightened and he spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. How could he stand against the tyrannical Jinqi on Fan Xian's sword? However, he had also successfully deflected Fan Xian's sword and gave himself a chance to live. In order to maintain his strangely high speed and movements, Fan Xian even abandoned his sword. His entire body curled up like a ghost and leaped into the middle of the other person's path. Without any fancy moves, he slammed his palm into the other person's chest with unusual speed and stability. With a crack, the person's sternum broke inch by inch. His eyes popped out as he died tragically on the snowy ground. Fan Xian turned around and swept away. Picking up the long sword and dagger from the snowy ground, the tip of his foot pushed off the snowy forest again and floated into the branches of the trees. Like a swan, he disappeared. This exchange was only 3 claps. This was what was called a flash of flint. Fan Xian looked at the 3 strong crossbows at the bottom of the forest and couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. As expected, they were city-guarding crossbows. Countless doubts and unease involuntarily rose in his heart. However, he was still trapped in the valley. He couldn't think about too many things. The strangely shaped and terrifying city-guarding crossbows were installed at the top of the mountain. Below them, there was a wooden tray and metal pivot to control them. The cables and springs needed a few people to work together to complete. The huge crossbow bolts were placed to the side. Fan Xian leaned against the snowy forest and watched this scene with narrowed eyes. He couldn't help but think of the powerful attack his carriage had received and the people who had died in the valley. The city-guarding crossbows were still slowly and steadily firing. 2 of the carriages in the valley had already been destroyed. The Overwatch Council had suffered heavy casualties. Although Fan Xian discovered there were 3 aces above the 7th level present, he still did not hesitate. Transforming into a large white bird, he leaped toward the 3 city-guarding crossbows. Fire! The person beside the city-guarding crossbows, who was clearly the commander, suddenly shouted. What was being released was not the city-guarding crossbows. Instead, it was a dense rain of arrows that had suddenly shot out from the bottom left of the forest. These assassins were clearly prepared. Fan Xian was in midair. Faced with this rain of arrows that covered the sky and covered the earth, it seemed that he could not avoid it. However, immediately after, everyone saw a scene that made them dumbfounded. Fan Xian pulled his right hand and flipped his clothes over, covering his head and face. As for his body, he was like a stone directly falling to the ground. He did not change his breath and forcefully twist his body. Instead, he directly dissipated the Jinqi in his body. He allowed himself to be like a falling leaf or a stone that followed the laws of nature and fell to the ground. It appeared simple, but the powerful shock from the change in Jinqi was enough to break the meridians of most aces in the world. Only Fan Xian, a Khanate monster, could use this method. No one had thought that Fan Xian would fall like this. Thus, most of the crossbow bolts shot toward the startled birds in the sky and forest. Only a few bolts hit Fan Xian's body. However, they were blocked by the robes the Overwatch Council had specially made for him and the extremely powerful tyrannical Jinqi in his body. However, Fan Xian still felt like he had been struck by lightning. A bone-deep pain made his eyes redden. He knew that he had suffered internal injuries. The surface of his body was probably already beginning to bleed. The moment his feet touched the ground, his entire body fell down. Like a snow fox, he slid quickly along the snowy surface and floated toward the 3 crossbows. The crossbow bolts shot into the snowy ground behind him. They stuck densely together as if to strengthen his movement. A fast knife came to meet him. Fan Xian flipped his wrist. The black dagger spread out like a ball of black shadow. In a moment, it met the knife 14 times. 14 clanging sounds rang out. The knife-wielding man retreated in fear. His face was green and white. It was clear that he had suffered a hidden loss. However, he had successfully blocked Fan Xian in front of him. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and glanced at him. He knew that this knife-wielding man must have an important position in the military. There were 2 other aces like this on the mountaintop. What Fan Xian needed was time. Thus, he retreated into the chest of the attacker behind him. Flipping his hand to hold his wrist, the black dagger stabbed out from under his armpit. The person behind him gave a strange cry and abandoned the knife. His palms came together and, risking the danger of the poison on the dagger, clamped down on Fan Xian's dagger. However, the strength of Fan Xian's stab was great. The dagger finally slid past the man's palms and cut into his body a little. The man roared wildly and slapped his palm toward the back of Fan Xian's head. Fan Xian didn't turn his head and returned his palm. Immediately after, the dagger pulled out and returned, using the hilt to strike toward the man's face. It was as if Fan Xian had eyes in the back of his head. The hilt of the knife pierced straight toward the man's eye socket. The man's left palm struck out again and blocked Fan Xian's knife hilt an inch in front of his eyes. Fan Xian's thumb pressed down. The hilt of the knife stabbed out with a sharp blade and pierced through the man's palm. Immediately after, it pierced through the man's eyeball. On the shore of the North Sea, even Shaoan had suffered from Fan Xian's attack, much less these aces in the military. The man did not cover his eyeball, which had liquid splattering in all directions. Howling wretchedly, he held onto Fan Xian from behind with unusual valiance. His left palm and eyeball were pierced by Fan Xian's dagger. His right arm was tightly wrapped around Fan Xian's throat. The knife-wielding man in front of him also chopped down with his knife. The knife was as fast as lightning and headed straight for Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. With a clang, he pulled out the dagger from the man's eye socket behind him and directly stabbed toward the knife-wielding man in front of him. Unexpectedly, the knife-wielding man did not care about his own life and death. With an explosive roar, he did not stop and allowed Fan Xian's dagger to stab into the right side of his chest. It looked like these aces in the military wanted to leave Fan Xian's body in this valley not far from Jingdo even if it meant risking their own lives. However, Fan Xian's left arm, which he had stabbed out, was still stretched out. In front of his arm was a dagger and at his wrist was a hidden crossbow. The sound of a spring rang out slightly. The knife-wielding man, who had used crossbows and arrows to kill a number of Fan Xian's subordinates, suddenly found that his eyes had darkened. Then a sharp pain came. Only then did he know that 2 crossbow bolts had pierced into his eyes. 2 delicate little black arrows had pierced into the knife-wielding man's eyes. Fan Xian exhaled fiercely and took a step forward with the valiant ace behind him. Dodging the knife edge of the knife-wielding man, he used his iron shoulder to block the other's right hand. With a crack, it was still the knife-wielding man's hand that broke. Fan Xian raised his foot and kicked out. With a muffled sound, the knife-wielding man in front of him was sent flying backward 30 feet by this resentful and tyrannical kick. He smashed ruthlessly into a tree trunk. His stomach split open and his intestines spilled out. It was a wretched sight. At this time the third person finally arrived. Fan Xian's foot had not yet been pulled back. However, he had been waiting for this person the entire time. He didn't pay any attention to the person holding him tightly behind him. His right hand was already gripping the hilt of the sword protruding from his shoulder. With a crack, the arms of the person behind him were chopped off. Like a plum blossom opening to welcome the wind and snow, like a small boat fighting in the ocean, there was not a trace of a sword that looked around blankly. Fan Xian coldly and sternly stabbed forward. The edge of the sword trembled slightly. It appeared weak, but it was stubborn. It looked forward and ignored the back, looked left and ignored the right, and won by pressing forward courageously. It was the sword Fan Xian had hidden at the bottom of the chest. It was also his most powerful attack when facing an enemy head-on. If it wasn't for the most dangerous moment, he would never use it. Sigu sword. The edge of the sword pierced through the throat of the military ace and lifted him into the air above the snowy ground. His eyes bulged out as he stared at Fan Xian. His hands were powerless and limp. A pair of curved knives fell into the snow. Those eyes seemed to be speaking, expressing their fear and confusion. It was as if they were saying, "How could such a sword come so silently?" Right at this moment, an unexpected event occurred. Fan Xian's sword lifted one person and tied another behind him. Under the snowy ground where he was standing, another person appeared. A gray figure burrowed out of the snowy ground with a faint aura. Holding a thin sword in his hand, he stuck close to Fan Xian's back as he stabbed out. This was a true killer. Fan Xian had hidden in the snowy ground and killed countless people. Facing the encirclement of 3 aces, he was both mentally and physically exhausted, so he didn't notice the strangeness in the snowy ground. Just as he was about to win, the enemy's final killing blow finally appeared. At this moment, Fan Xian only had time to take one step forward. He then felt a burning pain from his waist all the way to the back of his neck. The faint sword pierced straight through Fan Xian's official robes, which could block most attacks, and left a wretched wound on his back. The sword intent did not stop. It shot into the sky and sliced through the band Fan Xian used to tie his hair. The person who had been sticking close to Fan Xian's back had long been shaken into the snowy ground by this strike. Behind Fan Xian was the assassin who had been hiding in the snowy ground for a long time. His back had been heavily injured. His long hair draped weakly behind him. There was also the sword that was about to take Fan Xian's life. Fan Xian's mental and physical strength were almost exhausted. He was unable to instantly mobilize the tyrannical Jinqi in his body. He only had time to turn his head. Looking back, the scattered enemy's jet black hair flew out and weakly hit the last assassin's cheek. Where it landed, a thin needle was stuck into the temple by the side of the assassin's face. It was thin and slightly trembling. It was as if a gust of wind could blow this needle off. The assassin's body froze for a moment. The sword aimed at Fan Xian's heart did not have time to stab out. Fan Xian's palm struck the assassin's throat. A rain of blood exploded from the back of the assassin's neck. The boy I like has a head of jet black and beautiful long hair. This chapter was difficult to write. The stock market collapsed and I'm having a small diarrhea. I sincerely call for monthly votes. Thank you. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. I support the author and support genuine reading. Chapter 443. Guys, I'm learning how to operate the book review on the new website. If I learn it, I can add a smart chat. A few days ago I looked at both. I was tired and I didn't know how to play. Really, I'm scratching my head. Also, the monthly votes are back in 5th place. Haha, I'll pull again. Also, of course, I'm not a lesbian. I'm a male, middle-aged, fat kind. The assassin's head flipped back. Only that lonely and thin spine hung upside down behind him. A blood-red and disgusting cavity faced the blue sky that had stopped snowing. Without time to catch his breath, Fan Xian pulled out the long sword stuck in the snow. His feet pushed off the ground and his body curled into a ball. He retreated backward with incredible speed. After his body curled into a ball, the area that was exposed to the air became smaller. The gray-white Overwatch Council robes covered his entire body without a single hole. The sound of crossbows rang out in the field. It was as somber as the Shihu iron zither, but it all shot around Fan Xian's body. His movements were truly too fast. Even the fastest crossbows could not accurately hit him. Occasionally, a few crossbow bolts hit, but they were unable to pierce through his body. Fan Xian swept to the top of the city-guarding crossbow. Circulating the remaining tyrannical Jinqi in his body, he flipped his hand up. How much strength did this require? The massive city-guarding crossbow spun in the air and smashed into the 2 city-guarding crossbows beside it. In this short moment, Fan Xian flipped his hand and flicked the tip of his sword, hitting the crossbow's spring in the air. The crossbow had already been knocked and was at its most critical moment. The Emperor's sword that Wang Qinian had sent thousands of years ago was indeed a precious blade rarely seen in the world. Wherever the edge of the sword passed, the spring string snapped without reason. The surrounding assassins panicked and roared angrily. They charged toward Fan Xian, but they ignored the problem of the city-guarding crossbows. Creak, creak. A series of shocking sounds rang out at the top of the snowy mountain. With 3 loud bangs, the city-guarding crossbows smashed together and immediately changed their direction. One of the spring strings had already been cut by Fan Xian. The fully metal crossbow bolt, which had been charging for a long time, finally shot out. However, it was not aimed at the valley. It was aimed at the ground. The powerful recoil caused the massive city-guarding crossbow to jump up. It flipped up half the height of a person and directly pressed down on the group of people chasing Fan Xian. When it ran over, it left a mangled mess of flesh and broken limbs. The 2 city-guarding crossbows that had been smashed were no longer able to control the bowstrings on the crossbow mechanism. With 2 whooshing sounds, the crossbow bolts flew out without any direction, shooting out randomly. 2 streaks of sharp light flashed past, and one of the crossbow bolts hit an old tree. How could the trunk withstand such a powerful force? The bark was difficult to fly, and the hardwood was sliced apart like tofu, creating a large hole in the middle. Immediately after, the tree broke off from the center of the hole and collapsed with a loud bang. The damage caused by the other crossbow bolt was even more shocking. It directly pierced through the bodies of the 3 snipers, directly impaling them on the snowy ground. Fresh blood flowed along the terrifying crossbow arrow onto the snowy ground, and the 3 snipers who had been pierced into meat skewers were unable to die immediately, moaning incessantly. Chaos ensued. Taking advantage of the chaos, Fan Xian once again hid himself in the snowy forest. Leaning on a tree branch, he panted heavily. He had to be careful not to let the blood on his back fall off the snowy tree and alert the snipers. The other party had crossbows in their hands. If another group of crossbowmen surrounded the heavily injured Fan Xian was not confident he could survive. His mission had already been completed. The density of crossbow bolts in the snowy forest had decreased greatly. The deaths of the three leaders made the ambushers feel a chill in their hearts and panic. Without anyone to command and without the suppressive effect of the three city-guarding crossbows, the pressure on the black carriages in the valley immediately lessened greatly. Fan Xian leaned on a tree branch and listened to the movements in the forest across from him. He knew that the shadow had already gotten ahead of him and had already disturbed the camp on that mountain. The morale of the ambushers was in chaos. The assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council finally had their chance to show off. The people of the Overwatch Council knew where the opportunity was. Without waiting for their leader to give the order, they had long charged out of the carriages. Pulling out the black metal drills at their sides, they dodged the already sparse rain of crossbows and silently and angrily snuck into the forest. In the carriage they had long put on their black official robes inside out. Like ash-white ghosts, they entered the snowy forest and began to use their methods and resentment to kill any living thing in the snowy forest at all costs. An ambush and crossbow battle that had been planned for a long time finally became a close combat battle in the woods under the reckless attacks of Fan Xian and the Shadow, these two aces. In this world, no one was better at killing than the assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Even the most powerful Qing army in the world was no match for the 6th Bureau in a close combat battle in the dense forest. Listening to the strange silence in the snowy forest, the occasional sound of crossbows, the occasional sound of breaking snow, the occasional sound of metal drills entering the abdomen, and the occasional wretched cry, Fan Xian knew that his subordinates already held an absolute advantage. The revenge killing was being carried out methodically. After the 200 crossbowmen who had ambushed the Overwatch Council had caused heavy casualties, they had no chance of survival. His heart, which had been tense all this time, finally relaxed. There were no survivors. Just as Fan Xian had predicted, the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau were ruthless and did not leave a single survivor. Of course, this was not just because the 6th Bureau was ruthless. When the battle was about to end, the remaining 20 crossbowmen committed suicide in unison. Fan Xian stood on the snowy ground and looked coldly at the 20 bodies on the ground. Looking at the faces of these bodies, he found that there was no sorrow or fear on their faces. There was only determination and loyalty. The Qing army was indeed the most powerful martial force in the world. If this kind of discipline and valiance were placed on the battlefield, it would be a terrifying power. Of the 30 or so Overwatch Council officials in the black carriage in the valley, only 20 or so were able to enter the snowy forest alive. Just these 20 people had killed over 100 crossbowmen. In the woods on either side of the snowy valley, behind the dark rocks and under the trees, there should still be a number of bodies whose blood had already frozen. Fan Xian's state of mind was agitated. He coughed and coughed up some blood. Slowly turning around, he looked at the bloody person on the ground. This person was covered in blood. One of his eyeballs had been pierced by a dagger. It was as ugly as a deflated wineskin. Both of his arms had been neatly chopped off. There was a bloody hole in his left hand, and his right hand had been broken by the tyrannical Jinchi. This was one of the 3 aces earlier. He had attacked Fan Xian from behind and had fearlessly held on to Fan Xian as he died. Unexpectedly, in the end, he had become the only survivor among the assassins. Fan Xian walked to this person's side and slowly raised his foot. Stepping on this person's face, he woke him up. The bloody person slowly woke up. His soulless gaze swept in all directions. He saw the Overwatch Council secret agents around Fan Xian and the bodies of his brothers scattered in the woods. After a wave of grief, he became determined. Suddenly, a pitiful expression shot out of his eyes. Enduring the pain, he said in a trembling voice, "Sir, don't kill me. I'm willing to do anything." It was a teeth-closing sound. Fan Xian's hand moved like lightning. He inserted his finger into the person's mouth and pulled forcefully. The person's jaw was pulled off by a bloody chunk. It could no longer be closed. Even a few teeth fell out. Fan Xian stretched out his hand and wiped away the blood on it in the snow beside him. "Don't think about killing yourself. You're still useful to me. Now that you don't even have a hand and can't close your mouth, how can you prove your loyalty with death? Help him stop the bleeding and keep him alive," Fan Xian ordered the subordinate beside him. He then slowly walked toward the snowy valley at the foot of the mountain. As he walked, he coughed up blood. Blood gradually flowed down his back. Hong Changqing followed behind him and wanted to help him up, but he stubbornly shook off his hand. Hong Changqing's luck was not bad. He had not died under the rain of crossbows. He had only suffered a light injury to his left arm. However, the other people of the Overwatch Council were not so lucky. Of the 30 or so trusted aides who had followed Fan Xian back to the capital, half of them were dead. Those who were alive were all injured and weak. As they walked toward the valley, the Overwatch Council officials along the way bowed slightly in greeting. This was respect for the commissioner from the bottom of their hearts. Everyone knew that if the commissioner had not fearlessly launched a sneak attack, the people of the Overwatch Council would probably all have died in this valley. The Overwatch Council officials gradually gathered behind Fan Xian. Dragging the only survivor, they returned to the valley beside the broken carriages. Fan Xian crouched beside his overturned carriage. His fingers pulled at the shattered shaft. Occasionally he glanced at the dead driver in the carriage. His expression was calm. No one knew what he was thinking. He had also refused the Overwatch Council subordinates' request to treat his wounds. Why was all of this? The valley was filled with provincial soldiers' corpses. Which faction was so daring to carry out an ambush in a valley so close to Jingdo? Who had the power to mobilize so many aces from the military and even move the city-guarding crossbows? The city-guarding crossbows were the second point of suspicion in this attack. The assassin needed time to set up the crossbows and needed to make a lot of noise. Why did the Jingdo garrison responsible for the safety of the Jingdo countryside not sense anything at all? What chilled Fan Xian the most was how the other party was able to calculate the time of his return to the capital so accurately. From Yingzhou to Weizhou, he had purposely set up a diversion and had the Jiangnan water bandits send out fake news. Then he had gone straight in. If they wanted to assassinate him, these soldiers would not have dared to lie in ambush near Jingdo for too long. How could they have calculated the time so accurately? Even more terrifying was that although he was close to Jingdo, Fan Xian did not let down his guard. He had sent out spies from a distance of 3 li. Why was the initial report from the spies that everything was normal? Did the spies not notice the abnormality in the valley? Until the shadow beat him to the warning, countless questions surged into Fan Xian's mind, particularly in one area, which made his entire body cold. The situation today was completely different from the one in the Hanging Temple. Today's situation was a dead end. The other party had used such great power and meticulous preparation. Without question it was to kill him. If it was the eldest princess who incited Yan Xiaoyi to act, then a great change must have already happened in Jingdo for the other party to be so unbridled and dare to look down on the emperor. However, if there was truly chaos in Jingdo, even if the palace could not send out news, what about you? Fan Xian thought darkly. But what about you? Even if everyone in the world was frozen, you must have a way to notify me. This was a mutually contradictory proposition. If there was no great chaos in Jingdo, then it could not explain why the eldest princess and Yan Xiaoyi dared to do such a thing. If Jingdo was truly in chaos, why did he not receive a warning? My lord, it's time to make a decision. A member of the Qinian unit, whose face was covered in dried blood, spoke quietly by Fan Xian's ear. The member of the Qinian unit had been with Fan Xian the longest, so his words were more direct. In a heavy voice he said, "Should we retreat to Weizhou and first make contact with Jingdo, or should we directly enter Jingdo?" Fan Xian was silent. He glanced at his heavily injured subordinates around him and knew he had to make a decision immediately. If the capital really was in chaos, returning to the capital would be suicide. He was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked at the faintly visible outline of Jingdo outside the valley. Coldly and valiantly he said, "Send out the signal for fireworks." Yes. A flaming arrow rushed into the sky from the snowy valley, carrying a shocking roar, carrying dazzling radiance, completely covering this great snowy sky and the dim sun. This was the Overwatch Council's distress signal. The entire Qing Kingdom's military and the Overwatch Council used this signal. Thus, Fan Xian was not sure whether the people who would be coming into the valley to receive him would be from the military or the Overwatch Council. He hoped it was the former. After an indeterminable amount of time, the urgent sound of horse hooves came from outside the valley. Horses neighed repeatedly. In the blink of an eye, a group of about 200 riders rode into the valley. These riders wore bright armor and held swords and spears at their sides. They were very solemn, but they didn't even have time to raise their banners. In Fan Xian's eyes, not raising a banner was even more strange. Having just experienced a bloody assassination, he didn't trust anyone. The leader was a middle-aged man of about 30. His expression was solemn, and a short beard fluttered below his chin. At his waist was a sword. However, there was a glimmer of confusion in his solemn expression. When he saw the corpses and horse corpses all over the mountain and valley, the overturned carriages everywhere, and the crossbow bolts embedded in the cracks of the rocks, other than confusion, there was boundless shock and hidden anger in this general's solemn expression. The general clenched his right fist and swung it up. In a loud voice he shouted, "On guard!" The 200 riders behind him immediately became alert and watched everything in the valley. The person's expression was dark as he rode into the valley. He rode directly to Fan Xian's side, who was sitting by the carriage. Very confidently he flipped off the horse. Holding the long sword in his hand, he asked in a heavy voice, "Are you okay?" Fan Xian coughed and looked at him. "What do you think? Who did this?" The general's face was full of murderous intent as he spoke through gritted teeth. Fan Xian lowered his head and suddenly said, "I didn't think that the person who came would be you. Is there no other general in the Jingdo garrison? To have disturbed you, the commander, to come and save people." The person who came was the second son of the Qin family, the present commander of the Jingdo garrison, and the most popular military figure in the court, Qin Heng. Qin Heng saw that Fan Xian was alive and could still speak. He knew that the enemies had certainly been purged. Only then did he relax and sigh. The Overwatch Council's first-level request for help. "Everyone in Jingdo knows you're about to return. Of course they guessed it was you. I was scared to death. How could I not come?" He lowered his voice and self-mockingly said, "If you died, who knows how many people in the Jingdo garrison would be buried with you." In reality, the moment he saw Qin Heng enter the valley, Fan Xian had relaxed. Since the Qin family still controlled the power of the Jingdo garrison, it meant that the emperor still controlled the Jingdo army. There shouldn't be any trouble in Jingdo. He still asked, "Is Jingdo all right?" Qin Heng understood what he was worried about. He shook his head and said, "Everything is calm." Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "Then, that is truly strange." Qin Heng also understood what he meant. If everything was calm in Jingdo, who would risk the emperor's anger to assassinate a dragon? Fan Xian briefly recounted the day's events to Qin Heng. Qin Heng listened with incomparable fear. He furrowed his brows and said, "These people truly have wild ambitions and do not die." Fan Xian suddenly looked at him and asked, "You are in charge of the Jingdo garrison. For such a powerful army to be buried in this valley so close to Jingdo? How do you explain this?" Unable to explain, Qin Heng straightforwardly said, "This is our problem." Fan Xian nodded. Qin Heng said, "Go back, your injury needs to be treated." He then sighed and said, "These people were very ruthless." "Have all your subordinates died?" "No." Fan Xian coughed and smiled slightly. "My subordinates are all waiting for you." A dozen Overwatch Council secret agents slowly walked out of the woods on either side of the valley. They all held crossbows in their hands. Calmly and coldly, they faced Qin Heng and the Jingdo garrison responsible for clearing the bodies in the valley. Qin Heng's expression changed slightly. "What? You don't believe me? Who do you think I can trust now?" Fan Xian smiled mockingly. "Don't forget I almost became a ghost earlier." Qin Heng silently shook his head and helplessly said, "If you feel that pointing these little crossbows at me will make you feel more at ease, then you can do it." He then furrowed his brows and said, "How about I accompany you back to the capital first? You might feel much safer there. Leave the clearing work in this valley to the Jingdo garrison. This has always been our job." This successor of the Qin family calmly and seriously said, "If it is really as you say and there is a military power involved in this matter, believe me, the Qin family will certainly help you get justice." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "There's no need. Let's go together. I want to keep these bodies." Qin Heng knew what kind of anger was hidden under Fan Xian's calm expression. He nodded and looked at the sniper at Fan Xian's feet, who was on the verge of death but not yet dead. He asked, "What about this survivor? I'm afraid the emperor will personally interrogate him." Fan Xian said expressionlessly, "All the dead people in this valley are mine. The living are also mine." They temporarily ignored the bodies of the provincial soldiers. They only carried out the officials of the Overwatch Council who had died in the line of duty. They also gathered the bodies of the assassins who had died in the woods on both sides. Fan Xian looked at the cold bodies of his subordinates and tilted his head slightly. He then glanced at the bodies of the ambushers and quietly said, "Take good care of the bodies of our own brothers. As for these people, why are they dragging so many bodies? Chop off all their heads and bring them back to the capital." At the side, Hong Chongqing accepted the order in a loud voice. Qin Heng watched this scene from the side and furrowed his brows slightly. If there were no surprises, these bodies were all good soldiers of the military. Although they had become murderers of the court's imperial envoys because of internal strife in the court, their deaths were not to be regretted. However, Fan Xian's humiliating body still seemed to make this young general feel a glimmer of discomfort. Fan Xian completely ignored Qin Heng's feelings beside him. With a mocking expression, he watched his subordinates chop off heads. After everything had been tidied up, the remaining bloodied bodies, horse corpses, and broken carriages in the valley were taken care of by follow-up people from the court. Half of the 200 Jingdo garrison riders dismounted and carefully helped the bodies of the Overwatch Council officials onto their horses. At the same time, they had the injured Overwatch Council officials get on their horses. This was all Qin Heng's decision. He knew that at this juncture, he had to think of all ways to pacify Fan Xian's anger and the Overwatch Council's anger. The Overwatch Council and the military had always had a close relationship and a long friendship. Because of the battle in this little valley, a wound that would never be healed would certainly appear. After Fan Xian also got on his horse, Qin Heng flipped himself up and calmly said to his side, "Have you ever thought that if the military truly wanted to harm you, I could completely kill all of you right now?" The Overwatch Council officials had already put away their crossbows. They were all heavily injured after the calamity. Qin Heng brought 200 riders, so he indeed had the confidence to say these words. However, Fan Xian didn't even glance at him. Behind the two of them were the horses carrying the bodies of the Overwatch Council officials. Suddenly, the body on one of the horses bounced up. The corpse was like a ghost that flashed across the distance between the three horses. It lightly floated behind Qin Heng and sat on his horse. It pressed tightly against his chest. It was so intimate, it was like his shadow. Qin Heng paled in shock. He only had time to draw the sword at his waist halfway when he felt the person behind him gently blow a breath of air on the back of his neck. It was very cold. Qin Heng knew that he had been caught off guard. Given the terrifying skills of the person behind him, if the other party wanted to kill him in such a situation, even if the great Grandmaster Yi Luyun came, he would not be able to save him. The shadow behind him was disguised as a common secret agent. He wore gray and white clothing. His head was lowered as if he was dozing off. Qin Heng was silent. He sheathed his sword and glanced at Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't look at him. He only narrowed his eyes and looked at Jingdo in the distance. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 444. It was pitch black on the other side of the city gate. It was cold and cheerless on the other side of the city gate. The city gate had long been cleared out. The people of Jingdo were blocked outside the cordon. With faces full of shock, they looked at the group coming from the south. They looked at the blood on these people, the corpses on the horses, and the young man with his back straight, riding on the largest horse in front. An uproar. Sir Fan Jr., who had been away from Jingdo for a year, had finally returned to the capital. No one had thought that he would come back with so many corpses and bloodstains, as well as a completely black Overwatch Council carriage that looked like it could fall apart at any moment. The commoners in the distance whispered and discussed in shock. Looking at the scene in front of them, they all guessed that Sir Fan Jr. must have encountered something dangerous on his way back to the capital. However, no one thought that this so-called danger had actually happened near the peaceful and bustling Jingdo. The soldiers of the Jingdo garrison silently led their horses and carried out protection on the two sides of the group. The commoners watched with faces full of terror. After confirming that it was not the court arresting Sir Fan Jr., they began to guess one after another. They thought of Fan Xian's earth-shattering past, the rumors in the past year, and the palace treasury's sensitive words. Even the stupid commoners knew that there were certainly people within the court who wanted to harm Sir Fan Jr. Although Fan Xian's matter in Jiangnan had affected his reputation to a certain extent, in Jingdo, he still had a very high reputation. The spring examination case, the unique bureau, the poems in front of the palace, and the trip to northern Qi. In the hearts of the Jingdo people, he was their greatest pride and the court's last conscience. Sir Fan Jr. Sir Fan Jr. The commoners looked at the injured Fan Xian and didn't know how to express their concern and support. They also didn't know how to greet him. They could only yell from a long distance. The yelling rose and fell. Qin Heng glanced at him from the side. A glimmer of envy appeared in his eyes, but he immediately recovered his calm. Fan Xian gazed at the dense crowd and nodded slightly. His expression softened slightly. He couldn't help but feel moved. He asked himself if he had done anything for these people from the bottom of his heart in this second life. Even the little bit of good he occasionally brought was remembered by these people for a lifetime. Although Jingdo was dark, the hearts of these people still leaned toward the light. Some of the more timid commoners suddenly screamed and pointed at Fan Xian's group of horses. Fan Xian didn't need to turn his head to know what had shocked the hearts of the people. The horse behind him dragged a door plank that had been broken off from the carriage. There was a dying bloody man tied to the door. The blood on this bloody man had already stopped bleeding. The blood that had flowed out earlier had already turned black, and his clothes and body were stained together. What was even more terrifying was that both of the man's arms had been severed at the shoulder, leaving only 2 bloody wounds. One of his eyeballs was also stained with blood and was deflated. There were also 2 arms that had been chopped off, tied to the edge of the door with cloth strips. This was the only survivor of the Shuegu attack. He had been dragged by the Overwatch Council all the way to the Jingdo city gates. Along the way, waves of blood flowed endlessly. The scene was wretched. Fan Xian did not have a sliver of expression. Waving the whip in his hand, he rode first toward the city gate. Passing through the dark city gate, he saw the snowy scene of Jingdo's deep winter. Fan Xian took a deep breath. Dozens of Overwatch Council officials wearing black robes came forward to greet him. One person silently held the reins of Fan Xian's horse. The others went to the back to receive their heavily injured colleagues. The face of the official holding his reins was dark. With deep pain he said, "I have failed in my duties." He glanced at Qin Heng beside Fan Xian. After the fireworks, the city gates were temporarily closed, so there was no time to go out to receive them. Fan Xian nodded and said tiredly, "Mu Tai, don't blame yourself. This has nothing to do with you." He continued, Mu Feng. Mu Feng quickly ran over from the back and stood obediently by the horse's side. An angry and uneasy expression rose to his face. Mu Feng is here. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and said, "Take some people to take these brothers to recover. We'll talk about the burial tomorrow." "Yes." Mu Feng accepted the order and left. Fan Xian said to Mu Tai, "Take some people and come with me." Mu Tai was confused. He thought to himself, Sir was heavily injured. Presumably, the palace would not be in a rush to summon him. Where was he going in such a rush? He knew he could not ask at such a time. He lowered his head and accepted the order. At the same time, he made a hand gesture toward the communication official on the side of the street. Fan Xian glanced at Qin Heng and asked, "After entering the capital, does anyone still dare to kill me?" Qin Heng thought about it and said, "No." Fan Xian said, "Then why are you still following me?" Qin Heng thought about it again and said awkwardly, "I'm afraid you're going to kill someone." Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "I won't kill anyone today because I still don't know who I should kill." The Overwatch Council officials who had followed Fan Xian back to the capital were taken away to be treated. Behind him were the officials and secret agents of the First Bureau. They walked quietly and solemnly into the depths of Jingdo. In a moment they had arrived on Tianhe Avenue. At the back of the group was still the carriage that was about to fall apart, the door, and the bloody man who was too horrible to look at. Along the way, everything fell into the eyes of the people of Jingdo. The crowd of onlookers on both sides of the road grew larger and larger. They couldn't help but let out a few gasps. At this time, the news had long spread in the marketplace that Sir Fan Jr. had received an edict to return to the capital to report on his work. Unexpectedly, he had been ambushed outside the capital. The Overwatch Council had suffered heavy casualties, and Sir Fan Jr. had almost died. Ever since that night 14 years ago when Jingdo bled with blood, Jingdo had been immersed in peace. It had been many years since something so shocking had happened. Fan Xian sat ramrod straight on his horse and walked forward. Behind him, people from the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council continuously gathered into the group. The group grew longer and longer, but it was still silent and somber. Seeing this scene, everyone in Jingdo felt a chill in their hearts. They didn't know if Jingdo would immediately flow with rivers of blood. No one dared to underestimate Fan Xian's boldness and ruthlessness. Most of the Overwatch Council officials in the capital belonged to the First Bureau. Fan Xian was the ancestor of the First Bureau. For an ancestor to be ambushed was a big deal. There was no need to mobilize much. The secret agents of the First Bureau in Jingdo all began to move. Those who followed Fan Xian joined the group and began to secretly investigate the spies hidden in the various manors. Fan Xian suddenly pulled on the reins and stopped the horse. He turned his head to glance at his subordinates, who wore determined expressions, and furrowed his brows slightly. Slowly he said, "There are nearly 200 people here. The first bureau only has 310 in total. Are you not going to do anything?" Mu Tai thought to himself that it looked like they were going to kill people for revenge. How could they bring fewer people? To openly kill people in Jingdo, no matter how much reason there was, they would probably be brutally suppressed in the end. Today the first bureau had bet all of their lives on Fan Xian. He gritted his teeth and replied, "We will all listen to your arrangements." Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought for a moment. "Don't let any more people come. I'm not going to kill people." Qin Hang, who had been following close to him, heard these words and his heart trembled. Then the group of people continued to move. Under the shocked gazes of the Jingdo people, they followed the normally quiet Tianhe Avenue and the flowing water on both sides of the road slowly toward the royal palace in the distance. Yan Bingyun stood at the window and looked through the glass at the road below. He looked at the murderous but silent group on the road. The crowd of spectators had already been dispersed by the bailiffs of the Jingdo government. Tianhe Avenue became more and more lonely. He looked at the person riding at the very front and sighed slightly. A subordinate knocked on the door and entered. He knelt on the ground and reported, "I've already sent someone to notify Qin Garden. The security has been raised to the highest level. The 6th Bureau has been fully activated and is already controlling the streets near the Bureau of Military Affairs. Have the 2nd Bureau put aside the unimportant work at hand and put all their efforts into investigating the ambush in the valley." Yan Bingyun didn't turn his head. He only looked at Fan Xian on the road. The subordinate accepted the order and raised his head to ask, "The commissioner is heading that way. Do you want to come to his aid?" Yan Bingyun thought for a moment and then said, "Make preparations. If he actually makes a move." His expression changed slightly. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and said, "Don't worry, he won't make a move. He can endure it better than us." The subordinate raised his head in shock and looked at Yan Bingyun. He wondered how Sir Yan Jr. could be so calm when the commissioner was attacked. How could he not rush out of the hospital to welcome the commissioner or stop the commissioner? Between the royal palace and the gray-black Overwatch Council, there was another building. There was a dragon coiling above and a stone lion guarding the door below. The yamen was wide open with stone steps at the bottom. It appeared indescribably mighty. Fan Xian silently rode his horse toward that building. The door he was dragging behind him bumped against the stone ridge at the end of Tianhe Avenue and finally broke apart. The bloody man's feet were still tied to the ponytail. He bounced on the ground and was dragged again. However, the pair of broken arms fell to the ground. An Overwatch Council official had long picked up the pair of broken arms. The bloody man was jolted awake and made a painful moan. However, half of his chin was already broken. He was also in a half-unconscious state and could not speak. This person was dragged along the ground by Fan Xian's horse. Blood once again spurted out and dragged out a long line on the snowy ground. A line of blood. At the end of the line of blood was that building. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the yamen on the stone steps. He looked at the indescribably mighty stone lions on either side of the stone steps and sighed in his heart. In the past, when he was in Jingdo, he had purposely put some distance between himself and this place because of the emperor's pressure and his own self-reflection. Counting up until now, this was actually his first time here. This was the center of the Qing military. Back then it was the Ministry of War. Later, under the new policy, it was renamed the Ministry of Military Affairs. Now, it had long returned to its ancient name of the Bureau of Military Affairs. Under the emperor's orders, the Bureau of Military Affairs controlled all of the Qing kingdom's military movements and was responsible for all matters related to external battles. During these decades of war, countless generals and commanders had emerged and obtained a great deal of land and wealth for the Qing kingdom. The Qing kingdom's military was the most powerful in the world. The Bureau of Military Affairs was the brain of this most powerful army. The people in the Bureau of Military Affairs had long learned of this shocking Jingdo news when Fan Xian entered the city. By the time Fan Xian and his group headed toward the Bureau of Military Affairs, all of the generals felt a glimmer of surprise and unease. A number of military officials had already run out of the Bureau of Military Affairs and were standing on the steps, watching Fan Xian and his group. Fan Xian sat quietly on his horse and did not dismount. He only looked at the tightly closed door on the stone steps. The door slowly opened. 5 or 6 officials of the Bureau of Military Affairs walked down with hurried steps. Behind them, The soldiers of the Bureau of Military Affairs gripped their weapons tightly and stared warily at the group of black-clothed Overwatch Council people at the entrance of the yamen. The scene seemed tense, but Fan Xian was not nervous. He recognized that the people who had come out to greet him were the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs and the third deputy Qingji. Presently, the old Qin master had always been sick at home. The people in charge of the Bureau of Military Affairs were these high-ranking officials. He waved his whip and stopped the right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs from opening his mouth. He did not give the other party a chance to express concern, anger, nervousness, pity, or any other emotion. Fan Xian slowly opened his mouth. I know that many of you do not want me to return to Jingdo, at least you do not want me to return to Jingdo alive, Fan Xian said coldly. But I still came back. The right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs wanted to say something but stopped. His eyes looked at the bloody person Fan Xian was dragging behind him. Looking at this unbearable sight, this high-ranking official, who had climbed out of blood and fire, only furrowed his brows slightly. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and said, I was attacked on the outskirts of Jingdo. Presumably everyone knows of this matter. The right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs had just opened his mouth and said, It is truly shocking. Without waiting for him to finish, Fan Xian cut him off and said, I don't want to know who the person who wants to kill me is. I only know that it is one of you. One of you. This set the tone for the conversation. The right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs was shocked. He furrowed his brows and retorted, Commissioner Fan was attacked. My colleagues and I all feel the same. However, the matter is not clear, please don't be too. Fan Xian ignored him. He only gently stroked the smooth whip and lowered his head on the horse. What need is there to explain? Do you recognize the person I'm dragging? Fan Xian glanced at the bloody man behind the horse and smiled slightly. Of course you certainly don't recognize him. Even if he is the personal general of some major figure in the military, you still wouldn't recognize him. This person is the only survivor of the attack on me today. He sighed. A very good soldier. What a pity. Fan Xian flipped his hand and lashed out with the whip. The tip of the whip was very long. With a slap, it landed on the face of the bloody man on the snowy ground behind him. However, the man was already on his last breath and had no reaction at all. Soldiers had their own aura. The people of the Bureau of Military Affairs had long learned from the Jingdo garrison that the small group that attacked Fan Xian this time had used city-guarding crossbows. Thus, the military would certainly not be able to escape responsibility. At this moment, the people of the Bureau of Military Affairs were all thinking about how to face the Overwatch Council's anger, Qin Pingping's counterattack, and the Emperor's anger. Thus, toward Fan Xian's clearly humiliating whip toward the military, their expressions only changed slightly. They were angry in their hearts, but they didn't show anything on their faces. From the front door of the Bureau of Military Affairs, another person slowly walked out. His figure was not very tall, but he appeared particularly valiant. His eyes in particular were reserved and aggressive. His face was stern and he carried a longbow on his back. Looking at the purple clothing on his body, it was clear he was a high-ranking official. Dressed like this, if it was not Yen Xiaoyi, the governor of the north who had returned to the capital to report on his duties, who else could it be? Fan Xian didn't even glance at Yen Xiaoyi. He only flipped his hand and lashed out with the whip again on the face of the bloody man behind him, leaving another terrifying wound on his already unbearable face. Immediately after, the tip of the whip flew out and swept up this person. A knife light flashed and the rope tied to the ponytail immediately snapped. The bloody man flew straight up, passing over the soldiers below the stone steps and landing heavily on the snowy ground in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs yamen. He smashed into the air, sending up a flurry of snowflakes and blood. He landed perfectly in front of Yen Xiaoyi. Yen Xiaoyi lowered his head to glance. No one knew if there was a glimmer of change in his gaze. Fan Xian raised his right hand. Mu Tai pulled out the knife at his side and walked to the side of the only remaining carriage. Holding the hilt with both hands, he chopped down forcefully. The knife light fell. The last of the ropes in the carriage could no longer withstand the force. Half of the carriage wall collapsed with a loud bang. Countless round objects rolled out of the carriage. They rolled past the messy wooden boards and the pure white snow. They rolled under the stone lions of the Bureau of Military Affairs and could not be stopped. They gradually piled up higher and covered half the height of the stone lions against the road. They were human heads. Countless human heads piled up between the carriage and the stone lions. Specks of dirty blood, countless open and closed blood-stained eyes, and threads of flesh tied to the heads drowned the chest of the mighty stone lions in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs. "The 200 soldiers who ambushed me are all here," Fan Xian said lightly. He waved his horsewhip and pointed it at the Qing military elders on the stone steps. "I have given you the living. I have also given you the dead. I hope you can also give me something." He then said to the indifferent Yan Xiaoyi, "Is your son well?" Finally, Fan Xian lowered his head and faced the 200 human heads by the stone lions. Pulling back his lips, he mockingly said, "What good heads?" Yan Xiaoyi raised his head. A bright light flashed through his eyes. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 445. Everyone could hear the meaning of these two sentences and the hatred hidden within. Yan Xiaoyi stood on the stone steps and stared into Fan Xian's eyes. It was as if he wanted to use his gaze to coldly nail him to death. He knew that he could not kill Fan Xian in Jingdo. This was a sorrowful reality. After so many years, he still found it hard to believe that even if the pretty boy on horseback in front of him cursed his son so sinisterly and threatened him in front of the entire capital, threatened him, he still couldn't do anything ahead of time. He was the son of a hunter, and the other party was the emperor's son. Yan Xiaoyi was not like the other elders in the military. He was not a noble family like the Qin and Yi families, nor was he a descendant of a noble family like the great prince. Although he had the eldest princess as a backer, in reality, his climb in the military still relied on his own strength. His present glory and lofty position as the governor of the north were all fought for with his life in the north, the west, and the south. His arrows were never a match. The front of his army had never been unable to hold out for 3 days. He had performed countless meritorious deeds for the Qing court. Thus there was today. Even though the emperor knew that he and the eldest princess had a close past, he still trusted him and favored him greatly. A few years ago, he had even made him the commander of the imperial army in the palace. What was the reason for all of this? It was because Yan Xiaoyi had a determined and powerful heart. As a superior 9th-level ace, in the entire Qing military, only Yi Zhong could contend with him. Perhaps it was the secret figures hidden in the depths of the old Qin family. Thus, Yan Xiaoyi had never feared anything in his life. Occasionally he would even wonder if his troops were facing a great grandmaster. Would the great grandmaster be able to escape his arrows? How could he be afraid of a young man? Even if the young man on horseback at the foot of the stone steps, in his eyes, was only relying on his father's and mother's great fame. Even if this young man's gaze was so cold and ruthless, but, "Don't provoke me." His eyes stared at Fan Xian. His gaze was like the startling arrows on his back. It was as if he was telling Fan Xian that if he wanted to, he could kill him at any time. Even if his identity was special, there were some things that were better left undone. Fan Xian was awe-inspiring and fearless. He raised his face and narrowed his eyes. Dispelling the slight pain, he smiled coldly to welcome the attack. He wasn't sure if the ambush in the valley was done by Yan Xiaoyi or not. Although the eldest princess was the most suspicious in this matter, there were some suspicious points that made it hard for him to make a firm judgment. But he still wanted to speak like this. Because one day Yan Xiaoyi would come to kill him. Since that was the case, he didn't need to consider too many things. Regardless of whether or not it was Yan Xiaoyi who did it, Fan Xian knew he had to do something that would shock the world to warn those who were secretly plotting against him that if they wanted to kill him, they would have to consider whether or not they could afford to pay the price. The 200 heads in front of the stone lions of the Bureau of Military Affairs were proof. The stone steps of the Bureau of Military Affairs seemed to be frozen by a gust of cold air. Yan Xiaoyi stood proudly on the stone steps while Fan Xian sat straight on the back of the horse. Their gazes just happened to be level. The murderous aura contained in their gazes was unbearable. Even the stench of blood that filled the surroundings and the stench from the head under the stone lion seemed to be afraid of their gazes and moved away. Someone coughed softly. Qin Heng led his horse to the side of the stone steps and apologized in a low voice to the right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs. He then straightened his body and smiled warmly at Yan Xiaoyi. "Greetings, Governor." He had come at the right time and perfectly blocked the confrontation between Fan Xian and Yan Xiaoyi's gazes, easing the conflict that was about to erupt at any moment. Yan Xiaoyi slowly withdrew his piercing gaze and calmly said, "Hello, Marquis. How has the old master been recently? I have returned to the capital, so I have to go see him." Qin Heng had long been made a marquis. The old master Yan Xiaoyi spoke of was the old Qin master, who had long been ill in the manor. Given Yan Xiaoyi's status as the northern governor, in front of the pillar of the military, the old Qin master, he could only call himself a general. With Qin Heng coming out to ease the tension, Yan Xiaoyi had to give him face. However, Fan Xian didn't have to give it. He lowered his head and played with the horsewhip in his hand. "You're blocking me and Governor Yan." After Qin Heng was speechless, he was stunned. He didn't understand what Fan Xian was thinking. Was he going to challenge Yan Xiaoyi in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs? Although everyone knew that Fan Xian was as famous as Hai Tang and was the publicly recognized foremost ace of this generation in the Qin kingdom, when faced with Yan Xiaoyi, no one thought highly of him. Furthermore, these two people's identities were not the same. This place was also special. How could they fight here? Qin Heng tilted his head slightly and said in a low voice, "You're injured." Fan Xian's expression was incomparably calm, but Qin Heng's heart began to tremble. After everyone in Jingdo learned of the news of the ambush, they were most afraid of this kind of situation. Everyone was afraid that Fan Xian would go crazy. If Director Qin Pingping was an old black dog, then Fan Xian was a little black dog. The little black dog had been viciously stabbed with a knife and went crazy. It would randomly bite without distinguishing between friend and foe. The civil and martial officials of the court were afraid that Fan Xian would go to war in his anger and shake the foundations of the entire Qin court. Fan Xian listened to Qin Heng's question and slowly replied, "I just want to ask some questions. Treat with courtesy and return with kindness. Give with a sword and return with a knife. Governor Yan, is this not the principle? Provided by a book friend." Added. There were some questions that Fan Xian was prepared to ask face to face, but he didn't have the opportunity to say them. The people of the Bureau of Military Affairs heard the words of knives and swords and thought that Sir Fan Jr. was about to go crazy. Unconsciously, they made preparations for battle. Although the Bureau of Military Affairs was mainly staffed by military officers and their martial power was not as tyrannical as that of the Qin Kingdom's 5 roads, it was, after all, the essence of the Qin military for decades. Muddle-headedly being bullied by Fan Xian at their doorstep, they had endured silently for a long time. There would always be a time to retaliate. All of the officers and generals gripped the hilts of their knives. Yan Xiaoyi could only bring 100 trusted soldiers into the capital. At this moment, these 100 trusted soldiers had long been set up in the corridor by the side door of the Bureau of Military Affairs. They watched nervously the 100 or so First Bureau officials of the Overwatch Council in front of the Yamen. The soldiers who had returned from the north had a weather-beaten expression on their faces. They had long been forged into an iron army by Yan Xiaoyi. However, what was different from the Qin and Yi families' roads was that these 100 trusted soldiers all carried bows and arrows. The Qin kingdom's Jingdo forbade crossbows but not bows. This was the confidence displayed by the martial royal family. The two sides faced off, but the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Qin Heng, who had been worried the entire time, relaxed. If Fan Xian had used words to pressure Yan Xiaoyi earlier and issued him an invitation to a duel, as long as Yan Xiaoyi agreed, even the emperor would not be able to stop it. Then the two sides would certainly be in a situation of life and death. However, the present situation involved the conflict between the Overwatch Council and the military. Qin Heng knew that this battle could not be fought because there were countless eyes in Jingdo watching. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or the system of court officials in charge of state affairs, none of them could watch as the foundation of Qin Kingdom's domination of the world collapsed with a bang because of the heads in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs. As expected, the sound of shouting came from the distance. The hooves of horses were slightly disorderly. A group of imperial soldiers wearing bright armor rode over. The Bureau of Military Affairs was located between the Overwatch Council and the Royal Palace. The reaction of these imperial soldiers seemed to be a bit slow. However, some of the clear-eyed people knew that the imperial soldiers had purposely left some time for Fan Xian to slightly vent the anger in his heart. The imperial soldiers represented the emperor's might. No one dared to look down on them, at least on the surface. Thus, when the imperial soldiers lined up and separated the people of the Overwatch Council from the Bureau of Military Affairs soldiers, no one expressed any opposition. Furthermore, the person leading the troops was the Great Prince. The Great Prince had once been the commander of the Western expedition and had deep ties to the military. Now, everyone knew that his relationship with Fan Xian was also very close. Seeing that he had come to mediate, everyone present let out a breath at the same time. They deeply felt that the emperor was wise. This person was truly too suitable. The Great Prince pulled the reins of his horse and came to Fan Xian's side. The worry on his face was immediately hidden. He nodded his head slightly and didn't say anything unnecessary. He only said, "Father knows of this matter. Go back to your manor and recover." Fan Xian looked at him with a not quite there smile, silent and waiting. Naturally he was going to leave. He couldn't really start a massacre here with the Bureau of Military Affairs. However, the people he was waiting for had not all arrived yet. In a moment, 3 eunuchs of the eunuchs panted as they ran in from outside the crowd. They passed on the emperor's verbal edict, expressing their shock and condolences regarding the assassination of the plenipotentiary imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road. They severely criticized the Jingdo garrison and secretly reminded and intimidated the people of the Bureau of Military Affairs. Then they ordered Sir Fan Jr. to immediately return to his manor to recover and wait for the court to investigate the matter before making a decision. In a moment, 2 officials whose bodies were clearly not very healthy also panted as they ran in. It was Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar. These 2 high-ranking officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs expressed their comfort toward Fan Xian as well as their incomparable anger toward the murderer. Shu Wu was an old acquaintance of Fan Xian's, but it was the first time Fan Xian had seen Hu the scholar's appearance. He found that he was even younger than he had imagined. At most, he was in his 40s. Fan Xian sat on the horse in silence for a moment. He then said to the great prince, "You understand me. I have enough face in the first round. For now I won't go crazy." The great prince nodded and said, "I'll see you off." Fan Xian pulled on the reins and spun on Tianhe Avenue. He turned the horsewhip to his left hand and raised it to point directly at the military people on the stone steps of the Bureau of Military Affairs. He waved it and didn't say anything more. The military people of the Bureau of Military Affairs felt that this whip from a distance seemed to have landed on their faces. Returning to the Fan Manor, the great prince asked about the specific situation in the valley at the time. After a moment of silence, he left the manor. Fan Xian knew that he was in a hurry to return to the palace to face the emperor's storm-like questions, but he didn't want to remind him too much. Even he himself still had many doubts about this matter. The palace had sent 3 imperial doctors from the Imperial Academy of Medicine to Fan Manor, but Fan Xian didn't need them. He only had the brothers of the 3rd Bureau apply medicine to his wounds. The remaining poison should be gone in a few days. As for the wretched wound on his back, he didn't know how many days it would take to heal. It was not until now that he was lying on his warm bed that Fan Xian's body and mind finally completely relaxed. Immediately he felt a thread of tiredness that was difficult to resist. Even though his back was still burning with pain, he still hugged the pillow and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke, the sky was already dark. A serving girl went out and brought in a bowl of rice porridge warmed with hot water. The person who had been standing by Fan Xian's bed accepted the porridge and helped Fan Xian sit up. Using a spoon, he blew on it carefully and slowly fed it. Fan Xian took a bite and pressed his slightly dry lips together. Gazing at his father who was carefully spooning the porridge, he found that after not seeing him for a year, his father's hair had grown more white and his wrinkles had deepened. For some reason, for a moment he felt his heart ache. "I've made you worry." Fan Jian didn't say anything. He only fed him a few more mouthfuls before putting the bowl of porridge on the table. Calmly he said, "Back when you wanted to enter the Overwatch Council, I told you that there would be problems in the future. However, since the problems have already appeared, there is no need to talk about this anymore." Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, "There are many things I don't understand." Fan Jian warmly said, "Tell me." Fan Xian told his father all of the questions he had in his heart when he was by the ruined carriage in the valley. He hoped to be able to give him some reminders from his father, who did not seem to reveal himself in court, but actually had a solid foundation and was skilled. Even the emperor could not force him to abdicate. "Since we have determined that it was the military who did it," Fan Jian said, "then we can analyze it. Other than the defense of Jingdo, the Qing army has 5 roads and 7 provincial soldiers. The border soldiers are the most powerful. The Yi family has 1 in Dingzhou, the Qin family has 1, and the Zhangzhou border soldiers are under Yan Xiaoyi's control. There is also 1 on the Nanzhao line. The strength of the provincial soldiers is basically negligible. Even so, the 5 road soldiers are not divided so clearly. For example, the Yi and Qin families have students and old friends throughout the army and have a certain amount of influence in various areas." Fan Xian paused for a moment and then continued, "For example, the Great Prince's previous expeditions to the west were actually a large army drawn from the soldiers of the 5 roads. Once the war ended, the soldiers returned to the various places." Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, "This is also one of the emperor's methods. Correct. These generals have been promoted to important positions because of the Western expedition. They are like the hands and feet of the royal family. They are not people that the Yi and Qin families can order around. Thus, no one family can control the 5 roads of the border soldiers alone. Strangely, even though Fan Xian had been attacked by an assassination, the father and son did not seem to feel much emotion or anger. They only calmly analyzed the situation. For example, the defense of Jingdo. Within a radius of 40 li outside the capital, it is all under the jurisdiction of the Jingdo garrison. The garrison controls 20,000 people. Inside are the Qin kingdom's most powerful imperial army, 10,000 people. There are also 13 city gate guards. They appear unremarkable, but they are directly under the control of the emperor's edict. The opening and closing of the Jingdo city gates is also an important yamen. The palace is also unified by the guards. Although, according to the rules of the court, the commander of the imperial army is also in charge of the internal guards, in reality, other than Gong Dian, the current commander who has truly done it, the rest of the time, the internal guards are all managed by the eunuch in the palace. Eunuch? Naturally it was Eunuch Hong. Fan Xian suddenly heard something strange in his father's words. Other than Gong Dian, who had truly managed to manage both the imperial army and the internal guards. He abruptly raised his head and said in shock, Gong Dian is so deeply trusted by the emperor? The first time Fan Xian came into contact with the defense forces of the palace was when he exchanged a blow with Gong Dian at the door of the Qing temple. He clearly knew Gong Dian and also knew that a large part of the reason for the hanging temple incident was that the emperor wanted to expel the Yi family's power from Jingdo and kick Gong Dian from his position as commander of the imperial army. But, according to what his father said, the trust that Gong Dian, or rather the Yi family, had received back then was truly terrifying. Then, why did the emperor forcefully push the Yi family to the side of the second prince and the eldest princess? Fan Xian faintly felt that he seemed to have grasped something important, but he still couldn't figure it out. He couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. Fan Jian quietly said, "Don't think too much into it." Although the emperor's divine foresight surpasses others, he would not go so far as to play tricks with the defense forces of Jingdo. As for why he wants to kick the Yi family out, I can guess a little. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "Father, what is the reason?" Fan Jian smiled and helped him lie down gently. Slowly he said, "Don't forget your mother's surname is also Yi. When she first entered Jingdo, she once beat up Yi Zhong. Wu Zhu also fought with Yi Luyun. Even if there is no relationship between your two families, the emperor would probably still be worried about certain things. During the hanging temple incident, the emperor did not trust you as much as he does now. But he is prepared to put you in an important position. Naturally, he has to guard against certain things." Fan Xian was startled and immediately sighed coldly. As an emperor, his schemes were indeed, but what meaning would such a life have? However, he had not thought that no matter how powerful his father was, there would always be times when he guessed wrong. "I don't have much affection for the Yi family," Fan Xian said. In his heart, he thought of the girl with eyes as bright as jewels. Not now does not mean not in the future. Fan Jian raised his brows and said, "What I am interested in is why the emperor is so guarded against you." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then quietly said, "Father, do you think this matter was arranged by the emperor?" In the outskirts of Jingdo, he had mobilized the military to kill people. He had even moved the city guarding crossbows. In the end, as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and in charge of all intelligence, he was completely unprepared. Every time he thought of this matter, Fan Xian always felt that behind the ambush in the valley, it was not just the craziness of the eldest princess's side. There should be something even deeper hidden. In his list of suspects, the emperor was naturally ranked first. As for the second, it's not the emperor, Fan Jian suddenly said faintly. Right now he doesn't even have enough time to love and pamper you. How could he kill you, unless he is about to die? Fan Xian was silent and asked, to be able to make the Jingdo garrison and Overwatch Council lose their effectiveness at the same time, other than the emperor, who has this power? The eldest princess and Yan Xiaoyi? He shook his head. Fan Jian smiled slightly and countered with a question. "You should be guessing something. Otherwise, why didn't you go into your own courtyard to have a look when you returned from the Bureau of Military Affairs?" To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.